Welcome to the Solutions Podcast, everyone. I'm Michael Rosmer.
And I'm Jim Pastor-Matzis.
And today we're going to talk to you about the exciting subject of wealth and income inequality. Are these things a problem? If so, why are they a problem? What are the roots of the problem? Would love to hear from you guys on that in the comments below. In the meantime, please click the subscribe button, the notification bell, and come back and check out these important things so we can help change the world and make it super cool.
Wonderful. I'm also going to be using my iPad here. I have some notes and I also will keep extra notes while we are going.
Hashtag sponsored post by...
So we want to go over a few things. So first of all, when it comes to wealth inequality, who do you hear speaking about it most? Like when wealth equality comes in mind, who's most vocal about it?
I think there's an interesting, you could look at this from a few different perspectives. Are you talking about individuals or are you talking about groups?
Individuals, maybe.
One of the people that I hear talking about it quite a bit actually is Ray Dalio. Mm-hmm. Not really, I don't think that he does an in-depth dissection of the topic, but more talks about it as a cultural trend that's affecting the world. He's talking about kind of how capitalism is broken right now, etc. And so he would be one big name that comes to mind of the people that I know of, though I'm sure there's lots of others. Obviously, who's his face? Was it Piketty, the very famous economist who wrote the massive study about where wealth inequality comes from and income inequality comes from, etc. So that would be one example, Thomas Piketty.
Jordan Peterson talks about it quite a bit from a clinical...
Interesting. Well, I haven't heard that, so I'm going to get filled in a little bit on your insights into Jordan Peterson's perspective.
Yeah, he has on his lectures mainly, not after he stopped being a professor. Yeah. During his lectures, he would cover different things like
cool.
This. And it's interesting. Do you know anything about the Price's Law?
Price's Law, I might, but I don't know.
Okay.
Another guy, obviously, Bernie Sanders would be a really common one on this subject. We get into kind of the whole political discussion. And I'm sure there's a bunch in Europe who I'm totally ignorant about, who are probably big political figures saying how, hey, this is an issue and we need to deal with it. So,
well, I think most people talk about wealth inequality because they want to get a better idea on how to get more wealth and why
You think so?
Yeah.
Interesting. I don't think that that's why. I think it's more like appeal for political points, place blame, complain about your problems in life, and rationalize how the government should be giving you things and stuff like that.
It's part of it, but like when I talk to people, there's lots of people that listen in the marketing world. Like when we approach a conversation like wealth inequality, like you'll be surprised. Like there's people that actually have quite a bit of money that still talk about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but they complain about it. They're not the side that are like, I'm on the 1%. And that's great.
No. Yeah, and so this is an interesting point, is the fact that people from many sides are talking about it is an interesting indicator of whether it's a problem. I mean, for quite a while in Hollywood, it's been popular to kind of talk about it, and maybe that's kind of virtual signaling, right? But yeah, absolutely.
So do you think it's a problem?
So I think that it is a problem, but I think it's worth examining why is it a problem.
Right.
And I would break that into two different categories. The one is the process, I think, is somewhat of a problem. And then the end result is, I think, somewhat of a problem.
Got it.
And I think there's two reasons that the end result is a problem. In my opinion, the first of these is the fact that high concentrations of power are not good for kind of a democratic process. Sure. You tend to open yourself up to a lot more corruption when there's extreme concentrations of wealth because, people can use it in a way that is not necessarily constructive to the overall. The second one, I think, is really, really interesting and probably not nearly acknowledged enough, but a very close friend, client, investor friend of mine was talking about it recently, which is actually the quality of life of a billionaire in a country with high income inequality is worse than in a country where there is low income inequality.
Why?
because of the fact that your availability of services is lower, because there isn't enough economies of scale to justify providing those services when you have a high degree of poor people and very few rich people. So if you just think about like, okay, let's look at a simple, very valuable example, which is high medical services, right? If there's like one or two people who are going to be able to afford to pay for these extreme medical services, you're just not going to have the doctors there who have that specialized knowledge. Whereas if you're in an environment where there's a large middle class who can afford these types of things, then that's giving an incentive to develop a lot of these services. So it's actually overall in the best interest, not just of the poor people, but the rich people, to develop a strong middle class. That strong middle class drives a lot of the other stuff. I mean, we're sitting here in Bulgaria, and I can tell you one of the big complaints I would have of someplace like Bulgaria, even more so when I'm someplace like Montenegro, is just a lack of access to conveniences as compared to what I could get, say, in the States.
And,
right?
and you think this is because the middle class is a lot smaller here?
It's for sure part of it. I mean, look, there's population dynamics in general. There's just fewer people, right? So that's why you have maybe more conveniences in New York than you do in, Montana, right? But within that ecosystem, having more people who can, like, the economies of scale benefit everybody in a sense.
Yeah.
So now they also expose risks, so there's another side to it. But I think it's really worth acknowledging that and saying, hey, listen, it's not good for us. Oh, and this is without acknowledging, kind of the populism and, kind of the disruptive nature that poverty has, the crime that tends to arise out of these inequalities, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there's a lot of things that come up.
Me and you were talking about in, when you get to a certain level, doesn't matter how much richer you get, the lifestyle is basically going to be the same. What was the number we were talking about?
I mean, so I would generally say, if you want to go to the extreme level.
Okay, and if any billionaires are watching, this is 100% just our opinion. We don't know.
We're not billionaires yet. Yeah, but I think that even so, you can kind of categorize out, and I probably talked to you about kind of my view of like, there's poor rich, there's very rich, there's, billionaire status, things like this. But realistically, I mean, heck, for most people, they're not going to spend more than $1,000 a day. Like, really, 10 grand a month of disposable income, 30 grand a month, things like this. But really, probably the magic number where you can have pretty much everything is somewhere between 2 and 7 million a year.
Yeah.
Around that, it's like, look, especially once you've already got a principal residence.
We're talking about net. We're not talking about making
gross.
that in revenue.
No. This is actually, real money that you can spend. At the end. Yeah, like
Makes
that.
sense.
I mean, it's just extraordinarily difficult to spend more than that without being very wasteful or doing things like buying professional sports teams, buying yachts, buying private jets.
Yeah.
Like, okay, if you want to get into like funding space travel, like Jeff Bezos, that's different, right? Of course, you can burn that money. If you're talking about, charitable causes, of course, you can, spend an almost unlimited amount of money in these sorts of things. But from a lifestyle standpoint, I mean, at $5 million a year, you can rent private jets fairly regularly. So you could fly private, which is kind of the highest level of travel, right? You could rent a crazy yacht for, a couple weeks in the Mediterranean, and you're not going to need to really own it, right? Like, who really cares? So for the most part, any of those things that you'd want, you can drive the best cars, you can have the best clothes, eat at the best restaurants, stay at the best places, have people take care of you in terms of household staff, et cetera, all without any problems.
You know why I'm asking?
Why?
Because I know that there is this expectation from people in the middle class or below when it comes to income that they expect, and I mean rightfully so, that look, if you have, say, a net worth of 25 or $50 million and you have the type of income that you're talking about, then it makes sense that you should be involved in something philanthropical or something. I don't know, something that contributes back to the community. If you're,
I literally was saying to myself, I don't know if it was, maybe I was thinking about what we're talking about here today, and kind of like mentally preparing, but wealth is often wasted on the rich, and that's not true of all people. right? I think some people do an amazing job.
Like Elon, for
Like
example.
Elon Musk, absolutely. Yeah, obviously Bill Gates. I think Mark
course.
Zuckerberg, what he's doing is good. I was watching Chamath, Social Capital. I think he's doing a great job. There's a bunch of people who are, and I think it's an increasing trend. It's kind of a popular thing, and hopefully it continues because, in my opinion, the reality is what are you doing with your money? Like I was telling you the other day, I think that you should die without a whole hell of a lot of wealth because you should use your money for something that matters. And some people, it's like they have this dynastic, pass it on to future generations. It's like, well, look, the future generations won't share your values. They probably don't have the skills to use your wealth as well as you do.
That's true.
And there's problems today that if they aren't getting solved today, you're going to have a generation of people who are dealing with those problems. So put your money to use. And I see a ton of rich people who I'm just like, what the fuck are you doing? What are you doing with your money? You have no creativity. You have no resourcefulness. It's just sitting there. I mean, and by the way, whatever it is that's important to you, right? One example is George Lucas. George Lucas would complain about the film industry. George Lucas was probably the one person in the world empowered to actually do something. He owned ILM, the biggest special effects studio in the world. He had made Star Wars. It's like a get out of jail free card to produce crap movies and still be forgiven for it. He's highly respected in the industry. He knows and can work with anybody. He had a net worth, his net worth's like $8 billion or something like that. He can deploy enormous amounts of resources to bring about the changes that he wants. And what the fuck is he doing about it?
Right.
Okay, he brought digital film in. He's done some things to advance things for sure. But compared to his complaints, I mean, he sat around and watched Family Guy with his kids. It's like, okay, well, that's nice to spend, an hour or two of your day on. But what's your life about? What did you accumulate all this money for?
Yeah.
Do something with it.
Well, I mean, it's not like all billionaires have billions of dollars in cash laying around,
True.
right? Because a lot of them.
But he sold to Disney for whatever it was, $8 billion or something.
Right.
So he actually does have the cash.
Yeah. Well. Yeah, no, that's what I was saying. I mean, rightfully so. You have an expectation of these people if they're holding on to all this money. I mean, not just for it to just stay in the bank, for you to actually use it for something. I mean, it doesn't have to be for philanthropy where you just put it towards a cause.
If you want to support art, if you want to support some sort of research, if you want one of the things that kind of was a big change that Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg decided was that they decided they would operate via an LLC. Jeff Bezos' wife also operates via an LLC. And the interesting thing here is they're willing to contribute causes that they don't get charitable tax receipts for. They're like, hey, look, if the thing that's going to be effective does that, great. Same thing, you could look at Elon. I think it was Larry Page was quoted, he's one of the co-founders of Google, was quoted as saying that rather than giving his money to charity, he'd rather give it to Elon when he dies. And it's like, that's a fair argument.
Sure.
Look what Elon's done.
Right.
He's got a pretty fucking good track record.
Right.
And so, Elon's not doing it through charity, but is he doing some cool stuff that the world is dramatically better because of what he's doing? Yeah, I think that's true. And so, yeah, I'm not necessarily intrinsically in favor of quote unquote charity in the traditional sense. And I think that a lot of the charity that there has been throughout history has been really stupid, where basically, it's one of the things I give Bill Gates credit for is, okay, yeah, Bill's giving a lot of money, but I think the bigger thing is that Bill has brought a mindset of, hey, I care about the output per dollar that I put in.
He's actually involved personally.
He is. But he's also created a culture amongst billionaires, because I think the thing that used to happen was you'd write a check to the Red Cross and you'd say, oh, I gave $100 million. I feel good. And it's like, yeah, but what was accomplished with that? Who gives a shit what you gave? Let's talk about what you achieved, because that's what matters. And I think that was a culture that for a long time kind of pervaded the wealthy class. And I think Bill has been a really good catalyst in shifting that thinking, along with the Giving Pledge and some other things that he's done.
So why do you think several billionaires, I mean, is it safe to say majority of them, are not following the footsteps of Bill Gates and Elon and the rest of these guys?
A few things on that. First of all, I'm totally unqualified to say whether it's the majority or how many people it is.
I guess that's true.
And I think there's also a spectrum of, hey, you have a $20 million or $20 billion net worth and you give $100 million away. And, you feel like, hey, I'm doing all sorts of good charity. It's like, well, in proportion to what you've got, there's not. There's a funny line from Warren Buffett So Warren Buffett and Bill Gates started the Giving Pledge, which is basically to go around to billionaires to get them to commit to giving at least half of their wealth away before they die.
You say half? I thought it's more.
It's half is the Giving Pledge.
Got it.
And Buffett was saying, some people were saying no, and he's like, I need to write a book sometime, how to live on $500 million. And that was kind of the point, right? It's like, hey, you've got $1 billion. If you give away half of it, you still have $500 million. Like, there's no reason that you shouldn't feel okay about that.
Right.
It's still a ton of money. But I think there's some interesting things that you can play with psychologically here. And actually, there was a recent study that I read about this. Was it one of the wealth advisory firms? Anyway, somebody came out with this, and they were talking about the fact that it's very hard when you've spent so many years accumulating it to give it away because it requires such a mindset shift. I remember even a friend of mine who, did quite well, built quite a successful company, made, a decent sized net worth. And he and I were talking one day, and he said, he's like, I've spent so many years trying to maximize the bottom line that now I sit on the board for some charities and help out, and it really bothers me to see a loss at the bottom of the sheet every time, And I think that's part of the interesting thing about you need to switch the metrics, right? So you can see a winning metric. Like for Bill Gates, it's like, hey, listen, how much have we reduced the deaths due to malaria?
Right.
How much have we reduced the deaths due to polio?
Got it. There's got to be some other sort of metric.
Yeah, you have to see an output for your input, right?
Makes sense.
So I think that whole psychology makes it quite hard. And I think that also that's part of, we as humans naturally have loss aversion, right? So it's hard to give something up because I think Bill Gates made this comment. He was like, hey, listen, it's almost as hard to give away your money as it is to make it.
Right.
And it's just, you're fighting your psychology, right? It's like, ooh, your psychology does not want you to give away. And which is, I think, maybe one of the reasons why social, quote unquote, social investments maybe work better psychologically is like, hey, listen, I'm not willing to give the money away, but I'm willing to invest in R&D into building, some cancer research technology, which is going to have a really big impact and really helpful, but I don't have to feel quite like, my money is just vanishing, right? And so, some of those things I think are worth noting. Going back for a second, just to kind of the two sides of what makes wealth inequality bad, and I'll maybe segue into this later. But the one side is the end result, right? Which I kind of mentioned those problems. The second is the process side, and what I mean by the process side is, to me, wealth and income inequality is symptomatic of other problems within society, right? And so, when people are poor, this indicates a lot of other things, and those things are problematic. Oftentimes, unfortunately, we have structural problems in society that demonstrate themselves in the form of wealth inequality. And I hope we'll talk about those a little bit later on.
Sure.
But I think it's worth it to understand that, like, I would often for a long time say, I was quite, for many years, not against wealth inequality, right? My position would be to say, hey, well, who cares how much gap there is between the rich and the poor, so long as the level of the poor is coming up. Like, you can sit and you can say, hey, listen, well, the average poor person today has so much more than 100 years ago, you should be happy, right?
Well, it's probably also because lots of people, you're walking the fine line with capitalism as well, because a lot of people believe that capitalism shouldn't be a thing. So, and that's sort of like the solution for wealth inequality. And if there was less of capitalism and probably more of socialism or whatever, or communism, like there would just, I don't know, I've read all sorts of different ideas. How that would equalize the wealth across different groups more. And I don't know, that's probably why you were so for it more?
Yeah, I guess, I think that I framed the problem somewhat differently. And when I would look at it, I do think that there's a lot to be said for paying attention to the median wealth/income, as well as the minimum wealth/income. And you want to be elevating both of those. And if you elevate them both, the argument would be, well, if you elevate the top more and faster, is that really a problem, right? I think that for the reasons I mentioned, it is a problem. But I also think that equality is kind of overrated, right? And there's lots of areas that we can look at this, but the idea that people should be equal really doesn't fit very well with reality.
Financially, right?
In all ways.
Okay.
Like, in terms of outcomes in any sort of sport, in terms of health outcomes, in terms of education outcomes, in terms of, like, ultimately you will have disparities in outcomes. It's not the idea of disparities that is the problem. It's you can get these disparities that are exasperated to a greater degree than they should be. And those either create structural problems or they reveal structural problems that you want to address. That's kind of how I would look at it.
Yeah, and truth be told, not everybody wants to be equal anyway. Like, not everybody wants to work a super competitive.
Totally. And it kills incentives, right? Like, I mean, that's the big failing of communism is, hey, if no matter how hard I work and how well I work, I get the same as you, then why would I work?
Right.
It's like, I might as well just, and people will be like, oh, well, you'd still work. It's like, yeah, maybe you would, but would you work as hard? Would you be as innovative? Would you, take the same risks? Would you, things like this, right? So I think that plays out on both sides.
I think one of the components to what contributes to wealth inequality is definitely the individual productivity.
Totally.
Right? And so I've had, so many conversations with friends of mine from back in the day from high school and whatnot. So they look at me today and they've seen how I've built multi-million-dollar companies and I've made a lot of money for myself. They're like, oh man, you're this genius, right? Like, wow, like this is crazy. And we constantly go back to, well, how did I spend my time the past 10 years?
Yep.
How did you spend your time?
Yep.
Right? And it's day and night.
Yep.
Like when they were out clubbing and having fun, I was working.
Yep.
And when you do that for an extended period of time, that really compounds.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I think there is something to be said there.
Yep.
So I don't, like, unless you won the lottery, it's not like you ended up in the 0.1% with a, snap of your fingers.
Yep.
So, yeah.
I think, so I fairly recently have had some somewhat differing thoughts on this. And I think that the thoughts that I'm going to express now are not immediately popular amongst people like us, entrepreneurs, small business owners, etc. Because look, basically everything that I have worked for, I have built it myself, etc. My intelligence, my resourcefulness, my hard work, my relationship building, etc., my willingness to risk, etc., have been responsible for everything that I have, okay? And so I think that a lot of people sit there and they say, hey, well, why shouldn't you get from that? And I think that's true to a point. But then I look at something like, well, now let's look at Facebook, okay? So Facebook now is whatever, a $500 billion plus company. They have, I don't know, 60, 80,000 employees, something like this. And so
I think it's quite more.
It could be. It could be. Anyway, the point is, it's a lot of employees. Yeah. And so in that environment, how much of the growth that Facebook has to do with Mark Zuckerberg?
I mean, okay, in the beginning, definitely majority of it.
Yep.
But it definitely declined with time, I would assume. Right?
Yeah, just simply because there's a function of just 100,000 people or whatever there.
True.
And so, as a result, the meritocracy part of it starts to break down, right? Because Mark benefits because really most of that wealth, and again, we need to talk about this in a second, is that most of it comes from wealth building, not from income, right? His personal income is not that high, it's the stock price goes up. And the stock price going up, look, most of those people don't own any stock in Facebook, so they don't benefit much. But he owns, 20-odd% of the company. And so when it goes up by $100 billion, well, he just added $20 billion to his net worth, right? Well, that was pretty fucking good for him.
What about Elon? I think he structures it differently with his employees. Like they all own a percentage, something like that. I don't remember.
There was a lot of people who made a lot of money off Facebook who weren't Mark Zuckerberg as well. So, but the point is that as a new employee coming in, your ownership share is tiny. And to be fair, when you come in late, you didn't take the risk, right? The argument is, hey, listen, the capital took the risk, therefore the capital should benefit. Right. Now, the flip side of this, and again, I want to get to this a little bit later on, kind of going through systematically, is when you have companies being bailed out by the government and all kinds of favorable treatment within the market, et cetera, then hang on, if capital's not really taking the risk because they're too big to fail, then why the hell should they benefit, right? It doesn't really make a lot of sense there. So I think that you have to kind of like, some of those arguments start to break down. But my point is simply that I don't think the same rules that apply when you're, I don't know, let's call it 0 to 20 million, apply when you're 2 to 20 billion.
Right.
You know, it's just like the reality is that your impact on those outcomes was markedly different. Markedly different. And so should you benefit the same? Like, and now, look, let's flip it around the other side, which is, well, if not you, then who? Right? So it reminds me a little bit of something, if you read the Steve Jobs biography, Larry Ellison, founder of Oracle, was very good friends with Steve Jobs. And after Steve had been kicked out of Apple, Larry came to him and he's like, hey, look, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to raise whatever it was, $10 billion. I'll put in $2.5 billion myself. We're going to buy the company. We're going to make you the CEO. You'll get 25%. And Steve was like, no, like I have my own plan for how I'm going to take Apple back. You know, I'm going to build up next, and then I'm going to get Apple to buy next, and then I'm going to, you know, this sort of thing. Right. And Larry was like, well, all right. He's like, but wait a minute. If we do about it that way, then how are we going to make all the money? And Larry's like, or Steve's like, Larry, this is why you have me for a friend. You don't need any more money. And Larry was like, well, I guess so. But why would I want all those other guys to make all the money? Right. And I think that's a fair point, right? It's like, okay, all these other people who got lucky as just random shareholders, some pension fund, some hedge fund manager, whoever, they really did nothing. Steve Jobs came in, he took this company from virtually bankruptcy to being the most valuable company in the world, and all these people made a fortune. Well, why do they deserve that? Like, you know, who are they? So I think the whole concept of meritocracy, which is an idea that I like there's a part of me that really, it's appealing to me, starts to break down when you have these scalar effects, right? And so I don't know that there's an easy solution to that. A similar example is with football players, right? Or any other type of sports player. I remember thinking like, this person's getting a $100 million contract to hit a baseball. Like, are you kidding me? We're not paying doctors very much. Like, how does this make sense? But then when you break it down, you think, well, hang on a minute. If you didn't pay them that, then where's the money going to go? Because you can charge it for advertising. Should the people who are paying for advertising pay less? No, that's stupid, right? They're getting an ROI. That's why they're paying for it. Should the ticket holders pay less? Probably not. I mean, they're willing to pay it. It's fair market, things like this, right? Should the owners of the team make more? Well, why? Because, you know, the players are the ones who are out there playing. So where should the money go, right? And this, I think, comes down to, you know, you can start to examine like, all right, there's probably some different regulation redistribution patterns. And this gets into the communism side of things, the socialism, whatever, where you're like, do you want to go there? How do you go there? Stuff like this.
So do you think there should be a mix then of capitalism?
There absolutely should be.
And I mean, do we not live in sort of a mix today? I mean,
we do,
you
absolutely.
Have stimulus packages just flowing in like crazy.
I mean, that should be criminal. That should be criminal.
Right.
Yeah. Like, what's going on with that sort of thing, I think, is totally and utterly ridiculous. And again,
Trump
I'll talk.
is asking for more, even though the guy is sick, which is one thing to think about.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not really. So I don't have a problem.
The best, by the way. It's not
wishing Trump the best. There you go.
Thank you.
Not proper to talk about.
We love you. Nobody loves Trump more than us, you know.
Thank you very much.
Anyway, I hope you're watching this, Trump.
Yeah.
You can come on the show, you know.
Whenever you want. I would like to take a quick pause to ask you guys to leave your comments below. Tell us your thoughts. There might be things that me and Michael won't cover in this episode. I mean, we will try to go as in depth as
we're going to cover
possible.
a lot of stuff.
But I mean, if there's something that we're missing that you would like us to chip in on some other episode, please comment below. We are checking all the comments. We will be responding to the comments. So comment below.
Absolutely.
So
maybe let's go back a little bit, because I'd like to be a little bit systematic about how we think about this and work through it. So first of all, do you think that wealth and income inequality is a problem?
For sure. Yes.
Okay, and why? Why?
Okay. Yeah, no, it's definitely a problem. I don't think that in the modern era, right, when there are so many resources, there should be poverty. There should be people dying because there's no food. I think that's insane. While on the other side, we have people making billions of dollars that don't know how to spend it. I think that's crazy.
So let me introduce an interesting thought on this. There's a great book called Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Thomas Sowell, a very interesting economist. And he makes an interesting point, one of which you've already touched on about the productivity. But the other one is he says, poverty does not need to be explained. Poverty is our default state. If you just think basic in, humans coming out from Neanderthals is we're poor. Right. We're all struggling. So what needs to be explained is not poverty, but wealth. And you need to start by understanding, how is wealth created? And that's going to start to give you some insights into what's going on here.
But do you think it's fair that somebody that gets born in some side of Africa, right?
Completely unfair.
Right. They don't even have the proper infrastructure so they can have a chance.
Sure.
So, people today would say, well, yeah, it's poverty when you can't afford to put food on the table, which I think is a fair statement. But I'm talking about the poverty levels where people don't even have any proper infrastructure in society to where they can function.
It's a huge problem.
Day-to-day lives.
Yeah, it's a huge injustice, for sure.
You don't think that should be explained?
Well, no. I guess the point is that from a causal standpoint, it doesn't need to be explained because it makes perfect sense why that is, which is they just haven't built that, right? You can go through and you can look at the topical reasons why it has developed in certain areas versus other areas. So in this book, he does that. He says, hey, why is it that Europe developed and Africa didn't, and things like this. And there's geological reasons for it and all kinds of things like this of why Africa is behind, right?
But I think it's worth diving into when we talk about wealth inequality because, well, like I said when you asked the question, there's those people that have billions of dollars and don't know how to spend it. And then there's those people that have absolutely nothing. And there should be some way of distributing the money to help those people rise out of poverty. And I know that now there's more people coming out of poverty than ever before.
Absolutely. So, yeah, just to give the stats, they could have run a New York Times article every single day on the front page for the last 30 years or something, with the headline that reads, today 160,000 people came out of extreme poverty, and it would have been accurate. That is how much extreme poverty has decreased over the last 30 plus years. It is an astronomical difference that most people are not aware of. So it's very, very good news. Now, when you're coming out of extreme poverty, you're coming to above $2 a day. So you could still be very poor, right? It's certainly not the end of the road. But the difference between going from $1 a day to $2 a day is a really, really big difference. You can kind of think of the equivalent of going from $50,000 a year to $100,000 a year and what difference that makes in your life. So that's some good news. And it's also, I think, worth noting, if we're kind of talking about solutions and progress, et cetera, that most of that is coming from China. So China is the biggest economic miracle in the history of the world. It's incredible, totally unprecedented how they've advanced and brought people out of poverty. And so there's lots to learn, I think, from the fact that they successfully did this. That being said, I think it's worth, so we can go back and we can look at poverty in its sense. It's okay, you can fight poverty, right? And when I think about fighting poverty, I think about kind of a few key things. One of the things that I think is really fundamental is infrastructure. Another, I think, is the ability to communicate. I'll give kind of an anecdote of this. As I travel around to different countries, I'll often kind of try to put myself into the shoes of the local people and think, okay, if I was born here, how would I behave, knowing what I know? And the one place that I remember being shocked was Egypt. Most places okay, I go to Serbia, all right, it's poor, people are making very little. I'm all right, what would I do? I'd work online, I would do this, I would maybe do coding, I would get into marketing, I would hire locals, I would have a competitive advantage, things like this. There are opportunities that can come out of there, even though there's some deficiencies in terms of the financial system, et cetera. Then I looked at Egypt and I was I don't know what I would do.
Right.
You're talking about...
And it's worth saying which part of Egypt, because there are parts that are way more underdeveloped than others.
Yeah, I was in Alexandria and Cairo.
Okay.
So, you drive through Cairo. Cairo is a city of 20 million people. It's extremely polluted. Yeah, just for the benefit of our viewers.
And it's the biggest single city in the world, right?
No, I don't think so.
You don't?
Tokyo, I believe, is
the most populated city.
No, Tokyo's big.
Is it?
I think it goes Tokyo, Mexico City, maybe Calcutta or one of these in India.
I don't remember why.
You can look it up on the iPad if
Yeah.
you want. But
Yeah.
anyway, the point is, it's one of the top. It's a very highly populated city by virtually any standard, right? And I mean, driving, I remember seeing these apartment buildings where there was no glass on the windows, and the air pollution is horrible. And I'm thinking, like, you just have dust blowing in your window. Just breathing properly is a struggle. Having clean water is a struggle. And it's like, in that environment, how are you possibly supposed to advance yourself out of this?
Right.
So I think, okay, well, what do you need there? Well, first of all, you need some sort of infrastructure that's going to provide you with at least that basic, right? I've seen some similar stuff in various parts of Africa. I think that Matt Damon was doing like some program on it about the amount of time people in some of these villages will spend going to get water. And they have to walk like a few hours to get water at the well and then carry it back. Well, most of your day is gone, right? Like, it's done. So if you just had access to clean running water that you could get, and relatively clean facilities for getting rid of
You would
waste.
instantly be more productive.
Yeah, you're far ahead, exactly, right? Then you don't have to deal with the same medical problems if you have clean air and things like this. Then you say, okay, well, I can actually get some places, like my transportation system is a disaster. Okay, well, that would be really helpful. All right, I have decent internet. That's helpful because now as soon as you have the internet, you open up enormous amounts of free education and global work opportunities.
Do you know about Mark Zuckerberg and the little project that he had? Well, it's not little. But well, it was little for him at the time. Now it's pretty successful.
Yeah.
That provides internet to all of those areas that...
I know he's working on it. I don't know how much success they've had with it.
No, as far as I remember, I read that they did pretty well.
Nice.
It
It might be a continuing project too.
Yeah. But
yeah, so
that's
like
great.
that open. Now, to be fair, I do think that for some of those people, internet is a little, it's 3 steps further than they need right now, right? Like,
Sure.
if you're living on less than $1 a day, you're suffering from malnutrition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
But with internet, you have access to information. So if somebody is really passionate about coming up with solutions and taking initiative, maybe they can access this information online when previously they couldn't.
Yeah. Now, again, granted, you probably can't afford a phone or a computer, so that's a problem. Then you're in a situation where you probably don't speak the language, so that's a problem. And so there's some of these foundational things that are almost, and that was one of the things I was thinking, like, I think if you're, say, in Serbia, you should absolutely be learning, like, English, maybe German or Chinese, right? Mandarin, probably. Like, that's basic, because the opportunities that open up to you by having that other language, like, the reality is, what, are you going to deal entirely with a local economy that really doesn't have a lot of money that can spend for you anyway? That's not going to be very effective. So, there's some things like that where it's a long-term development thing, which are useful now. And the malnutrition thing is a problem too. I think Bill Gates is working on something because they've identified basically people's brains don't develop properly if they don't get, there's something to do with your microbe, your microbiome. And I don't know all the details about it, but basically if your microbiome isn't healthy and you're not absorbing nutrients properly, then your brain doesn't develop well, and then your IQ is much lower, and then that has all sorts of ripple effects later on as well. And so as we move to an increasingly information-oriented economy, and as, like, look, locally, what can you do? And apparently this is fairly well studied, that ideally what you want is you want a society to first take care of food production. This is like the most basic thing, right?
Sure.
Okay, you get agriculture going, then you transition to some sort of manufacturing, then you transition to some sort of kind of information type society, which China has done very well. Now, there are some arguments. I just read this book recently, Good Economics for Hard Times, and they looked at some of the challenges of developing, say, an manufacturing export culture in a place like Egypt as compared with China, and how what China was able to do probably can't be reproduced very well in some of these emerging countries. The idea that people say is like, oh yeah, cost of wages is going up and things like this in China, but they're like, the problem is that today, because they've already driven the cost so far down, because it's so efficient to manufacture there, because it's a known commodity, because they've established supply chains, things like this, the risk for purchasers of taking a bet on this little guy in Egypt who, maybe he can reduce the cost of that t-shirt by $1, you're like, it's just not worth it, right? So, you may find a scenario where they have to leapfrog that stage and go to something different, right? I think I told you, I hired a coder in Kenya recently, which is super cool. And so hopefully, there will be a lot of that type of thing that will emerge and help to, provide more opportunities for people in these areas that it just doesn't make so much sense for them to build manufacturing infrastructure, for instance.
Yeah, no. Well, so let's go back a little bit on the individual productivity.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
I think you were saying something about that, but I might have interrupted you.
Yeah. I mean, Thomas Sowell was just kind of looking at look, there's this erroneous perspective which suggests that wealth is measured by what you have, as opposed to measured by what you produce. And the thing is, if you produce, then over time you will have. Mm-hmm. So, but if you have and you don't produce, then over time you probably won't have. So this is one of the reasons why just giving money to people isn't a particularly good idea. It's kind of the tradition of the famous story, give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime, right? And so building, and that's partially why I'm talking about the infrastructure as well, right? It's okay, by enabling, if you give people a lot of enabling resources, and the truth is enabling resources are very broad, kind of going back to Mark Zuckerberg, one of the things I'm super impressed with his wife is if you look at what they're doing with the Chan Zuckerberg Institute, they're starting these schools, and in these schools, they're not just looking at the educational component, they're also looking at the mental health, they're also looking at the family environment, they're also looking at nutrition, they're also looking at homelessness, all this whole halo that goes into the productivity or the productive education, because what they found in reality was there's a lot of cases where it's the kid is having a problem, and you're this is an education or a discipline problem, and they're no, the kid's not getting sleep at home properly because they're homeless,
Right.
It's you're going to a homeless shelter, and so if you take care of that problem, a bunch of other problems help to resolve themselves. And it's similar to kind of a little bit of a conundrum in the world right now that they're talking about with respect to kind of the climate change side of things, is if you look in third world countries, in Africa, say, you have a bunch of places where they don't have electricity. And so if you can give them books, but they can't study at night because they don't have power to look at the book, right? So if you then raise the price of power by saying, hey, well, we're going to put a global carbon tax on this is going to hurt them in ways that's just totally unjust, right? And so they're saying, hey, look, however they can get power, they should get power. Because their first, most basic desire should be to get proper nutrition, to have proper safety, to have those base level from which they can step out into a much better position. And I think, as I understand it, one of the big problems with a lot of that is corruption. So, I mean, there's many, many other issues, but the corruption problem is a huge one, where it's and again, this is exasperated by wealth inequality, right? You have a few people who have a lot of resources, they've got guns, they can hire their armies or whatever, and they can go and steal, and they use starvation as a weapon, right? It's well, that's horrible.
Now, I want to jump onto something else. I think that the way that rich people get richer is with tax optimization, right?
Okay.
Right. So
it's on my notes of things to talk about, so it's great. Yeah, we can dive into it.
So do you think people should be better educated about tax optimization? For example, people are going nuts about Trump paying $750 on the other year.
Which there's some nuances that's not totally accurate, but anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
Probably.
Yeah.
But it is in the spectrum of tax optimization.
The lifestyle that he lives compared to the amount of tax that he pays do not seem proportional to one another, right? That part I think we can lay out fairly clearly, which I was kind of surprised that people were shocked by this, because I was why did you think he wasn't releasing his tax returns? You think it's because he paid a few billion in tax? No. If the guy paid a few billion in tax, he would have been releasing his tax returns for sure. Would have bragged about that stuff. So the only reason he wasn't releasing it for sure was because he didn't want you to see how little he was paying.
Do you think people should be better educated on what tax dollars, how they pay taxes?
So, I have a few perspectives on that.
Make sure to click that button.
Yeah. I want to make sure you can still hear me. So, yes, but I think that the tax code should be fairer and should be less complicated. So I think the fact, I was appalled reading people's Twitter comments about how uneducated people were about tax and finance. And obviously these are things that I'm very educated on. So, there's a certain spectrum that maybe I'm not really very well connected with what's going on. But I think that it is criminal that we don't have financial education in schools, that they don't teach you.
100% agree.
Yeah, it is unbelievable. It is something that we were talking about solutions. Financial education in schools should happen from grade 1 to grade 12. And part of that should be the simple understanding of the difference between business and personal, understanding between revenue and profit. Like people were like, oh, hey, this guy has all this and he didn't pay any taxes. It's like, well, yeah, because he had no profit, right? So
somehow, lots of professors,
yeah.
I can tell you personally about my professor.
Yeah.
He believed that math is business education. And it's very fundamental. Now, there is, of course, a fundamental need to understand math.
Absolutely, yeah.
But understanding a very advanced level of math is not is not required at all.
Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, you're pretty decimals, fractions, you're pretty much there.
Right. Well, no, but I think I don't know if people in the education system really understand that there is such a gap.
Yeah, I don't think. I think that unless you know it, you don't understand that the gap is there. Because if you did, then that would be. And look, it's reflective of the fact that, again, to me, I think there's this gross deficiency. Look, business fundamentally is really important to the function of society, and you have an enormous number of people who have never run a business. Mm-hmm. So they don't really know what that's like. They don't really have the perspective. Just reading people's comments, I could tell you've never filed a business tax return before.
Right.
If you had, you would know some of these things. Now, okay, maybe you wouldn't know about a conservation easement and things like that. Maybe you wouldn't know about 1031 exchanges and on and on. But at least you should know some of these basic principles. You should understand how write-offs work. Right. You should understand, hey, listen, it's really not surprising that a reality TV star would have written off $70,000 in haircuts over the course of a 18-year career on television or something like this. Mm-hmm. This is actually probably fairly reasonable. They don't understand, hey, listen, how does it work if you're going to hire your family members for a company? Mm-hmm. How you determine what to pay them? How you can justify consulting? How these things work? They just don't understand these topics. And I think that's concerning. I have this statement I've been saying for quite a few years now, ever since I owned my spa, which was 2012 or something like that, a long time ago, which is, I don't think everybody should be a business person. I don't think they should necessarily be an entrepreneur, but I think they should all have a stint trying to run a business. Mm-hmm. Because I think there's things you learn through that process that are very difficult to learn otherwise.
Right.
And
you build a discipline as well that helps you financially.
Yeah, look, you can build that discipline, I think, in other ways. I don't think that you have to learn that.
True. My mom and dad never ran a business, but they are very disciplined financially.
So, my mom actually does now, but my mom was always disciplined, right?
Yeah.
And I think that comes from being in poverty, right? My grandma and my mom were very poor growing up and things like this, and so. But I think some of the things I think of is the concept of value. Right? And this comes back to the discussion about productivity. A lot of people think, I worked hard, therefore I deserve. But that's not the way the market works. Right. The market does not reward your effort. The market rewards your output. And
value would also
be results. The market basically assigns value to certain types of results. And if you can produce those types of results, you can make a lot of money. It's also based on negotiation and things like this. And so if you haven't learned those things, well then, your whole concept of how the world works is fundamentally misaligned. Another example is what things cost. I remember, we'd have these employees, and I'm sure they thought we were just making money hand over fist. And I'm like, they don't realize that I have to pay 10 grand in rent and rental of equipment before anything else, before the month starts.
Right.
I'm at $35,000 before I hit break even, So that first 35 grand, okay, they've got their wages, all these different things happened, and I made zero at that point in time, So it's and then even over and above that, you have a cost of goods sold and so on and so forth. So by the time you make 45 grand, you didn't really make 10 grand, you made, I don't know, maybe 7 grand in profit or something.
I think it's safe to assume that if they had basic business education, they would understand those things better. Because lots of employees have very unrealistic expectations when they walk into the workforce, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. But I think that, to me, I would separate out business education from experience running a business. Mm-hmm. The difference between learning something in books and actually doing it,
Day and night, no.
And the thing is that running a business is something really accessible. Like, you can run your own little small business and get a lesson doing that, especially if you're talking about over 12 years of education, right? So from grade 1 to grade 12, you gradually advance this business education. You can do little projects, right? It's like, great, you're going to go out and try selling something. You're going to make t-shirts and put something on them and sell them and calculate at the end of the day how much profit you made, where the money went. And you can gradually, at first, maybe you don't account for the value of your time. And then later you have to assign an hourly wage. You're like, oh shit, you start to find out that this is not so easy. And you can work on distribution and so on and so forth. So all of that stuff, I think, is fundamental and it's deeply concerning. I think that one of the key parts for sure, about helping to reduce the inequality between rich and poor is to educate people on wealth and on wealth building.
True.
And so part of that, I think, is just understanding finance and business and how money is made. But I think another one is taxes. Now, we can dive into taxes a little bit. So
okay.
I have a lot of opinions about how the tax system should be improved. So from my perspective, and keep in mind, I'm somebody who helps people to optimize tax, right? So,
which is why I brought it up. There's just so many little different components to how wealth inequality could be fixed.
Yep.
I'm just trying to go over them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I hope if we can go 5 hours, let's go 5 hours.
Sure, absolutely. So, I would start by saying that it's worth noting that there are 3 ways that you save on taxes. Most people don't get this, okay? The one is you can reduce your tax rate. The second is that you can reduce your taxable income. The third is that you can defer the tax. So my basic idea is I'm a justice person. I have a strong justice mechanism. I think there's a lot to be said for fairness.
Right.
And so I think the optimal tax system should be one where it doesn't really matter how you make your money and it doesn't matter how you do your tax planning. You end up paying the same tax regardless. Because I think it's a bad use of society's resources to be spending a whole bunch of time figuring out how to optimize your tax. You'd be better off taking that and spending those resources on making the world better somehow. So the fact that you can devote a fairly large portion of resources, time, energy, money, intelligence, etc., figuring out how to optimize tax is not good for society. Because it's here, I think you're stupid not to take advantage of it, right? But I think that we as a society should be looking at the structure of tax and saying, hey, listen, how do we make it so that this is not someplace that we're consuming resources? So we can kind of go through those one by one. So start off with tax rates, right? Well, the fact that capital gains and dividends in a lot of parts of the world are taxed at a different rate than earned income, I think is a problem. This is kind of the Buffett plan, is to eliminate that, right?
Okay.
So, in the US, as an example, well, in a lot of the world, it turns out to being about half the tax rate, right? And the question is, well, why should that be? Like, really, you're incentivizing people not to work. And working is good for society, assuming they're putting it into something productive, etc. So why would you want to tax somebody at worse? Now, the ideological philosophy is, hey, well, you already were taxed on that money. So now you're reinvesting after-tax dollars, therefore you should get a tax benefit on it. And they might say, hey, well, we're incentivizing investment, therefore we're going to do this. Now, Buffett's argument is that's total nonsense. Tax rates used to be way higher and people still invested. Like, you're going to decide what to invest in, and you're going to do that regardless of what your your tax is, more or less. If it was 100%, then maybe not, right? But whether you're taxed at 40% or 20% is not going to determine the fact of, hey, I'm not going to invest anymore. Like, it's just not going to happen, right? So that's a lie. And so I think that you should eliminate that. Now, this brings in another part of it, which is a very, very common piece of effort that is put in by small business owners. And again, here we see this distinction between small and large businesses, right? So in a big business, what do you care, right? It's like, okay, you're earning a wage, you're earning a dividend, but in a small business, the business has to pay tax first. And so now you're incentivized. If you're taxed the same on dividends, that's part of the reason, right? You get this double tax. So they say, hey, well, the business has already paid taxes on that money. So when they pay out a dividend, the dividend should be taxed at a lower rate, right? This is the theory. Capital gains has less of an argument for it. I would say that, and then what ends up happening is usually there's socials. So payroll liabilities of some sort, whether it's pension contributions, unemployment insurance, whatever it is that happens to exist. And usually there's an employer portion of that and a personal portion of that, right? So the business is saying, well, hang on a minute. if I pay myself a wage, then I may end up with less money than if I pay myself a dividend. So should I pay myself a dividend or a wage? And they're spending time and they're talking to their accountant, burning up cycles on this very basic question. This should be a non-issue. Like, just tax dividend or apply payroll liabilities to dividends, so it's the same, and then make dividends a tax write-off for the business, just like wages are, and you're done. That's very simple.
Why do you think people complicate it so much?
I mean, I think there's a whole host of reasons. So first of all, the idea of payroll liabilities being on dividends is kind of a crazy idea to people, right? Because the whole idea is that, well, you're earning a pension from it. So you're contributing to a pension fund, so that doesn't necessarily make that much sense, right? Usually unemployment insurance is a portion of it, so that doesn't make so much sense, right? My argument would be, well, hang on, we have an aging population, so we need to adjust those numbers anyway. So contributing into it, I think you should just want to simplify and knock that out. But that would be one part of it. The second part of it is, like I said, you've had this double tax issue. And countries have different systems. So for instance, in Singapore, they have what's called a single imputation system. The company pays tax.
How's it called?
It's called a single imputation system,
Okay.
which means that if there's tax paid at the corporate level, there's no tax paid at the personal level on the dividend. And so that's fine, right? You can do that. And you could do it that way instead of the way that I'm proposing. I think that the challenge there is that the personal tax rate is much higher than the corporate tax rate. And so your net tax means that people who own the business ended up ahead of those who did not. So my idea is that, again, how you earn the income shouldn't determine how much tax you pay. Your tax paid should be the same regardless based on how much income you earned, not how you earned the income. So right now, just to draw the contrast, in Singapore, the highest tax rate is 22% personally, okay? In other words, that if I'm in the highest tax bracket and I'm earning a wage, I pay 22%.
There's different tiers based on your income?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, which is normal in most parts of the world. There's some
Yeah.
sort of progressive taxation.
Okay.
But if I have the business, well, the business pays a maximum tax rate of 17%, okay? So, and then I pay a dividend to myself, I don't pay tax on the dividend. So I saved 5% by earning through a business rather than earning personally. Like, why should you do that? It's the same work, right? It doesn't make any sense to me. I think, hey, listen, just let the business write off the dividend as a payment just like they would if they were paying out wages and tax them at 22%.
Right.
Then it's the same. So that's one of my solutions as kind of like a proposed idea for how these things can be better on that side of it. And I think we could look at, hey, is progressive tax a good thing? Because some people will dispute that, right? A lot of people say, hey, we should just have a flat tax, we should eliminate the loopholes, etc.
What is a progressive tax?
A progressive tax is when the more money you make, the higher your tax rate is.
Like Singapore and I think Greece is the same.
Oh yeah, Greece, Canada, the US, Australia, most of the world has progressive tax. And I think progressive tax makes a perfect sense because if you're below the poverty line, why should you pay tax?
Right.
Right? It's like so progressive tax should be helping to redistribute to reduce this income inequality. And I mean, the extreme version of it is that some of these people in government are saying, hey, there should be an extreme wealth tax, like over $100 million, you should pay some ridiculously high rate of tax.
I think it was like 1% a year, most of the suggestions that I read.
They were talking about of your wealth.
Okay.
So you're gonna, and I think we can talk about wealth tax when we get to deferral because that's an important point.
Sure.
But yeah, in terms of tax rates, I think generally speaking, the tax rate should be the same. And you can pay attention to, okay, what if you have international, what if you have domestic, things like this. And usually, I don't think that's really a huge deal because usually you get a tax credit for taxes paid abroad, and so the end tax remains the same. This brings us to the second part, which is deductions, right? And deductions, I think, are perfectly reasonable, but I think that probably we should treat everybody as though they have their own business. And I'll give you an example of why I think this is important. I saw some comment on Twitter the other day, and they said, hang on, how come Donald Trump's allowed to write off his haircuts when a teacher isn't allowed to write off their school supplies?
Okay.
And I think this is a legitimate question. Like, what's going on there? Well, what's going on is very simple. The teacher is an individual. Individual tax returns don't have write-offs for that sort of thing. Donald Trump is operating via a business, and the business wrote off that expense. So I think you should say, hey, listen, really, if you're a teacher and you're spending money on school supplies, that should be a valid write-off for you.
Absolutely.
And so you should be able to do this. So basically, you should address that just by saying, hey, listen, people are businesses, and they get to write off expenses which are reasonable to their business. And Now you get into, but on the other side, this is part of the financial education, and this is Robert Kiyosaki is quite good about educating people on this. Is understanding the difference between paying tax on having after-tax income versus before-tax income for expenses is a big difference, right? I bought a laptop the other day. The fact that I can spend that from pre-tax dollars rather than after-tax dollars saves whatever the marginal tax rate is, right? It's basically like the government just paid for part of the laptop. Sure. On top of the fact that, you have VAT or GST or whatever it is in your particular country, and so you can qualify to get that back. So the advantages of operating through a business really cannot be understated.
Absolutely.
Like, everybody should know this. This should be a basic, like in grades 1 to 6, somewhere in there, you should figure out that you need to have a business and you need to take advantage of this, because the person who operates through a business has an enormous advantage over the person who does not.
So if you don't study accounting, you better make sure you have a good accountant that you can consult. Sure,
but the point is that an individual who's not operating through a business won't have an accountant and won't even think to go down that road,
So they have to push themselves to educate themselves.
Yes, but society really should educate you on that. If society builds a framework of rules, society should have the obligation to educate you about those rules, in my opinion.
Like in school.
Exactly. Yeah, like everybody should be taught this. This should be, how the system works should be taught so that at least people can say, hey, if they don't want to take advantage of it, that's up to them, right? But at least they're exposed to the rules of the game. Mm-hmm. Imagine if you're playing chess with somebody and you're like, oh, I forgot to tell you that knights can go over different pieces. Mm-hmm. It's like, sorry about that. Well, that person has a huge advantage over the person who doesn't know that rule, right?
Oh well, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we should do a whole episode on education reform and what should happen there. But there's definitely no question that business education, tax education should be part of the today's school system, and that it's pretty outdated.
Yeah, I would throw education about credit in there too.
Credit?
Yeah, because credit is such a big part of society. True. Like, if you're not being educated on credit, then again, you're set up at a disadvantage compared to people who know the rules of the game.
In some countries more than others, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, in some countries credit is not so popular, et cetera. Certainly in places like the U.S., Canada, et cetera, where there's sophisticated credit systems, you should understand how that credit system works. That should be part of the education. It's like teaching somebody to drive, teaching them to type. These are the rules of the game that you live in. How can you not teach the people the rules of the game? I mean, it's really good for somebody, I guess, who wants to beat those players. But for society as a whole, I mean, it's asinine. It's totally ridiculous.
Well, so this is quite a massive industry. Why do you think nobody's... so there's people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon and those people that are creating their little education systems, per se, that... so they're taking some decent initiative. But why don't institutions on a broader scale take action? The colleges and for-profit and this and that.
It's a good question.
Could it be ignorance? Could it be that people in the higher ups are just not well aware of the changes that must be made? Could it be that there's some sort of risk into making radical changes in the educational system? What's the problem here?
I think there's probably a lot of problems. So I think it's not a simple solution. We like to have a very basic approach, but I don't think that's very valid. So let's kind of go through some of the things that I would say are probably at work there. So the first is just kind of a general awareness and it being on the priority list. And I think the priority list becomes the second part after awareness, which is, okay, I have 6 hours a day that I'm teaching students. I'm already teaching them math, science, phys ed, social studies, language, whatever. Where do you want me to fit finance into that education? I'm already overwhelmed as a teacher. I already have too much stuff on my plate. Kids are already being pushed to learn more and more and more. We've got this advancing, increasingly complex world. Where do you fit it in? What is the piece of subject that you're going to take out in order to fit that in?
I mean, it's a great question. I don't know.
And by the way, I'm not asking you to answer that question.
No,
I'm saying
it's certainly an interesting point.
Yeah, I think that's part of the discussion that happens, which creates paralysis, right? Because everybody is kind of lobbying for their cause, right? My cause is math, your cause is science, mine is literature, mine is something to do with psychology or social or, People
should be opting in to things that they're interested in. Not everybody wants to know about I don't know, like advanced biology
Sure.
or I do think that people should have some basic understanding of ancient history, which is always taught in schools, and history in general. But yeah, there are some specialized studies that I think are like could be replaced, or you could give the choice to the student that yes, I would like to study this, and that, and they end up leaving out whatever this one extra is, where you can fit in finance.
Yeah, and I mean, look, again, I think we can have a whole conversation about the education
Absolutely.
system.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
we'll go and we'll do a whole episode on that. But I think that balances like that are an issue. Then I think you get into the thing of, as much as I'd like to say, hey, listen, we should teach this in school, I don't trust the government to come up with a good curriculum. Like, I've seen what they've done with diet, and it's a disaster. Like, the food pyramid, are you kidding me? Like, it seems to me to be the result of the lobbying industry. Hey, we have to appeal to the dairy lobby, we have to appeal to the meat lobby, we have to, all these different things. We have to appeal to science, so let's put some fruits and vegetables in there. Like, you run down this list and you're like, what the heck is going on here? Like, this is bizarre. There doesn't seem to be any scientific backing for that. And so similarly, like, what are you going to teach? Then you have the quality of the teachers, right? Well, do the teachers understand anything about finance? So how is that going to factor in? And
Multivariate for sure. There's not a single thing that you can do to change that.
I think it is very hard in general to change the curriculum. Like, I think that there is a lot of resistance to that process, and I think probably justifiably so to some extent, because we see what happened in, I think it was it Kentucky or Alabama or something, where they decided to teach creationism instead of evolution, right? And what an uproar this creates. And it's like, do you want the flat earthers to be able to get there and be able to change this curriculum to teach flat earth stuff? Well, that sounds horrible. So you want a certain resistance to change, but at the same time you need a flexibility to bring in the things that make sense to change. And so I don't think that it's a very simple problem to solve. I think that there's a lot of pieces, and it might be interesting at some point we can interview some teachers, some people from the Department of Education, from things like this, to kind of have this discussion with them of like, hey, listen, like, what is the process? Because I would like to understand, what's going on there, and what is the mechanism by which these things get reformed? Because clearly society is changing, and as society changes, it needs to be a malleable process. Even like, one of the things that Elon says, which I think has a lot of truth, is laws should probably have an expiration date on them. Because if they're good laws, you should be no problem to reinstate them. And if they're bad, at least they can get phased out. Like, it seems to me that when things are brought in, they're brought in like just, hey, we're bringing this in. As opposed to, I think about kind of from a marketing standpoint, right? You should run it like a split test. You're like, okay, great. We've introduced this. Now let's measure the outcomes. Do the outcomes work? If the outcomes work, let's just follow the data. And the data says, hey, this is good. So, maybe you didn't like it. Maybe your biases were totally against it. Who gives a shit about your biases? Like, let's follow the data. Yeah. And to build a culture of following the data, which we're a long ways away from in government,
Absolutely.
Right? That's a huge, huge issue.
Okay, taking a step back. Okay, we're back to wealth inequality. What causes it? Would it be fair to talk about the different personality traits that the people have in 1%?
Well, let me finish going through on the subject of taxes first.
Tax. Okay, yeah.
Because I think
You're talking about tax rates.
Yeah, so the next one we talked about was write-offs, right?
Sure.
And the fact that people get a lot of advantages from write-offs. The third thing, though, I think that's worth talking about is deferral. And by the way, there's a whole bunch of, we can look at the write-offs thing, for example, and we can look at the Trump situation as a good example of this. Real estate is incredibly tax advantaged in places like the US and Australia. Okay, You can have property that's called negatively geared property, which is positive cash flow property that has a tax write-off associated with it. And the way that they achieve that primarily is through depreciation, right? So you can just kind of think of what happens is you say, okay, great, I bought this property and the property cost me 300 grand. I'm going to depreciate that over 30 years, and so I'm getting a 10 grand a year write-off on the depreciation of this property. And now, the theory behind this is, well, hey, listen, over time the building breaks down, you have to replace the roof, you have to replace the hot water tank, you have to replace the heater, things like this. And there's some truth to that. But when do you replace the foundation? When are you replacing the walls? When are you replacing the windows? When are you ever replacing the land, And so the whole concept of depreciation on real estate to me is asinine. I think that what it should be is you should just say, hey, listen, as you have expenses, write off that expense. So if it turns out that you have to, instead of writing off your roof, depreciating your roof over time, say, hey, listen, when you have to get a new roof, just pay for it, and that's an expense that year.
Right.
You know, and then if you never are replacing anything, well, you never have any write-offs. You know, okay, you're paying tax. So that was one thing in Trump's situation that he benefited a lot from, was the fact that he could write off hundreds of millions of dollars via depreciation. So that's kind of a write-offs thing. And I think there's lots you can play around with on that to say, hey, listen, what should be written off, what shouldn't be. What they allow in Hong Kong is extreme. What they don't allow in Denmark is extreme the other way, right?
Got it.
This brings us to the deferral side of things. And to give some context to this, Tony Robbins does this thing on the importance of deferral. And this is highly underrated. So the most common place that we see deferral is in like a 401k, a Roth IRA. In Canada, you have a TFSA, you have an RSP. Various different countries have various types of retirement structures which allow you to defer the tax. So basically, either you don't pay tax at the front end, you put it in and it grows, and then at the end you pay the tax, or you pay the tax, you put it in, when you take it out, you don't pay tax, right? One of these two ways that it works. But all stocks that you're holding for a long period of time benefit from deferral. All real estate that you haven't sold benefits from deferral. And in fact, there's a strategy on real estate that basically you just buy the real estate, you hold it out for 10 years, then you refinance, you borrow the money. When you borrow the money, you don't pay tax on borrowed money, so you can live off that money. Then it keeps growing. Another 10 years later, you refinance it again, you borrow money again, and you can basically just never pay tax if you have a sufficient size real estate portfolio, which is outrageous because if you were to earn the same amount of money, again, you would have got taxed a whole bunch along the way. So the effects of deferral, on top of the fact that when you sell that property, you get a capital gain as opposed to regular income, so you have to pay the tax rate on the end. On the top of that, you have write-offs, which you benefit from. Like if you just think the person who's working for a wage compared to the person who's making their income through real estate, the person who's making his income through real estate makes far more money at the end of the day after tax, because the tax system does not do these beneficially. So this brings us to the question of, okay, well, what do you do about deferral? And this is where I'll come to the numbers to explain how significant this is. So the Tony Robbins example is this. He says, okay, say you take $1 and you double it. So 1 becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32, and so on and so forth for 20 years. Okay. At the end of 20 years, you have approximately a little over $1 million. Okay. Now let's switch it around and let's say you get taxed each time at a rate of 33%. Okay. So in other words, 1 becomes 2, but then you get taxed on the 1 gain, so you have 1.67. Then you double the 1.67, and you get taxed on that, and so on. So at the end of the same 20-year period, if you had $1 million based on not being taxed along the way, how much do you think you have at the end being taxed, the 33% along the way?
Oh man, must be significantly less.
What would you guess?
There's probably lots of people that know math that already know the answer, and I'm probably going to say something silly. No, I don't know, something very low. Like, is it still in the 6 figures? It is, right?
Yes.
Oh man. All right, let's say 150. This is a pure guess, like just significantly less.
So just kind of for you guys at home, it would make sense if somebody said 670,000, right? Because you can say, well, okay, I have 1 million less 33% is 670,000. The answer is far less than that.
It compounds, right? Like over time.
So that's the whole point, right? Is that even if you were to compare to, like, at the end the person takes the money out, they pay their 33%, which again, keeping in mind if it's a capital gain, they pay half the rate, so they're actually lower. Again, depending on the country. Some places you don't pay capital gain, which is even more crazy, right? So say, okay, great.
His brain goes crazy when he talks about tax. You guys might notice.
Anyway, so it turns out it's a lot less than 330,000 that you save.
Yeah.
So somebody might say, okay, well, it's a lot less, maybe 300,000. Turns out it's a lot less. So you say, like you do, 150 grand. The answer is $28,000.
That's a huge difference.
That's an enormous difference, right?
You went from $1 million to 28 grand?
Yeah, and actually you literally saved over $1 million that way. Now, this is somewhat of a disingenuous example because nobody is starting with $1 and no one's doubling their money every year for 20 years.
Oh, okay, but it's definitely an interesting
it shows
thing
the effect
to think about.
Of deferral, right?
Right.
And so you can see how, listen, where did all these people make their money? Bill Gates, did he make his money off earned income? No. Value of Microsoft stock. Mark Zuckerberg, where does his wealth come from? Value of Facebook stock. Jeff Bezos, where does his money come from? Value of Amazon stock. Google, other investments, etc. Elon Musk. net worth went up by $60 billion this year. Did he earn any of that? Virtually none. It's pretty much all the value of the stock going up. Every single case where you have this stock being held, you're benefiting from deferral. Because for the 20, 30, 50 years that you built that company, you paid no tax on that growth.
Right.
Only at the end did you pay tax, and then you got taxed at a favorable rate. Is this equal? Of course this isn't equal. This is outrageously different. So we can say, all right, well, so the question then becomes, well, how do you deal with that, right? And this is where, okay, we have property tax. Property tax, I think is a good idea. And in states, like if you look at Texas has high property tax but no state income tax, as compared to California, which has lower property tax and insane state income tax. The Texas way is probably better. There's a bunch of reasons to argue that it's actually quite good to have higher property tax because it's less likely to decrease your economic output of the country, the region. But so okay, that's one thing you can do to some extent. Another thing you can do, of course, is when you tax it more heavily on the back end, right? So when you tax it at the end, like saying, hey, listen, the capital gains rates get eliminated, you pay full tax rate. Okay, great, that's one thing that you could do. But that really doesn't make up for all the value of deferral. And so then they say, okay, and this is the Thomas Piketty suggestion, is, hey, we need to have a wealth tax, right? I'm pretty against wealth tax. It was quite popular. Elizabeth Warren, during the Democratic primaries this year, was advocating it. A lot of these people advocated. And it makes a lot of sense because, again, just recognizing that most of the disparity between extreme rich and regular people doesn't come from earned income, so raising the earned income tax rates doesn't help you anyway. It comes from building wealth. Why do I think that wealth tax is a horrible idea? First of all, because it's really hard to value a lot of these things, right? They've actually tried it in a few countries, places like France, and it's never really been successful. They've had to, it's like, people leave, they have to shut it down, it's hard to calculate. It's fine if you're talking about like public market securities, right? Okay, I have money in cash, I have money in bonds, I have money in public companies. But if I have private companies, if I have real estate, okay, so. Art, unbelievably difficult, right? Like, how do you know how much that painting is worth? Who knows, right? So I think that's the first problem, is that it's just hard to value.
Yeah.
And the complexity of trying to figure that out is probably going to favor a certain group of people as opposed to another group of people. It's going to just add to your bureaucracy. It's not probably a good idea. The second thing that I think is problematic about it is oftentimes people don't actually have the cash to turn around and pay that tax. So the reality is that
what we were saying just before, just because somebody's worth 10 billion doesn't mean they have 10 billion in the bank. So what are you taxing? Are you going to tax their stock? What are you going to tax?
Exactly, and I think it gets worse because then you say, okay, well, you force them to sell the stock. Now this drives the stock price down, which, by the way, most of the shareholders are probably pension funds and things like this, right? So you're actually hurting people's pensions, et cetera. And by the way, all the people who hold those pensions now potentially have to sell their stock too. So you have this cycle of kind of wealth obliteration, which is not really so good. But on top of that, they risk losing control of their company, right? So do you want Elon to lose control of his company because he has to pay the wealth tax?
Right.
I think it's really not fair, to be honest with you. Like, I just don't think that it's a good idea to end up in a situation where people may lose control of their company because they have to pay this wealth tax, right? So,
do you think there should be a new tier then in the people that have billions of dollars, or I don't know, an extremely big amount in liquidated assets, that those people have to pay just more taxes? We're talking about strictly the money that they've netted that is in the bank.
I threw out this radical idea, and I think, we can have the radical ideas on our podcast. So one of my ideas was that because you can kind of, again, you can tax bonds relatively easily. You know the value of the bond. It's not a big problem. I think you can tax cash basically through inflation, right? You just print more money. Okay, great. Over time, we're going to inflate the value of your money away. So if you're holding cash, you're going to lose out anyway. Something like gold and commodities, we have a current market value for, which actually, by the way, this is another problem, right? Is you could end up where the market pops, you have to pay tax on it, then it collapses back down. What are you going to turn around and refund them? Like, how are you going to keep track of this, right? But you could do something like that for things like gold, right? You could say, okay, great, because you could pay the tax in gold, and then you wouldn't have to worry about it so much if the price went way up, right? But I think there's a reasonable argument, or at least a reasonable thought experiment that could be made, that for when it comes to companies, the way the tax should be paid is that more shares should be issued, and those shares, that can be non-voting shares, should be given out to society as a whole. And how you would distribute that is a little bit questionable, right? But I think it's an interesting idea, because what ends up happening then is the benefit of those local companies benefits everybody, right? It's like, okay, great, we're basically participating as shareholders in the growth of our companies, and we want those companies to succeed. And I think that it wouldn't probably erode the net worth of these rich people, very likely. It'd be a very small amount, right? 2% new shares issued or something like that, right? And they could turn around, they could sell them, you could buy them back if you wanted, you could do whatever. But I think that's an interesting thought experiment that I haven't heard people really talk about, but it would be very easy to do.
Who would control the society's funds, right? Because there's quite a bit of corruption when you're just...
Well, one of the ways that you could do it is you could basically just evenly distribute it to everybody in society.
Okay.
You could say, okay, great, we're going to issue these shares, and basically everybody in the system gets these shares, and now you have your shares. You have your little piece of Tesla, you have your little piece of Amazon, you have your little piece of Microsoft, you have your little piece of whatever else out there.
Considering that it was so hard to just send everybody money, like with the stimulus now that they were doing in the US, do you think such system is...
I think it could be done very easily today.
Right.
I think you'd have to invest in the system up front, right?
Okay.
But basically what you would do is you would have some sort of an identification system, kind of the equivalent of an identified crypto wallet that would be tied to your social security number or something like that, right? And basically then you could just digitize all those shares, and you would basically just auto distribute them on...
So if you want to access them, you just...
You just log into your wallet. It would be like a cryptographically stored wallet, and off you go. And so you could choose to sell them if you wanted. You could choose to keep them. You could choose to whatever, right? They would have whatever value they would have. The market would decide that. And if the value went up, you'd benefit. If the value went down, you'd be hurt. But that's it. Basically, you would be in it together. And I think that from my perspective, the whole idea of wealth inequality and combating that, really you do have to look deeply at the difference between income inequality and wealth inequality. And a big part of the problem, so if we go to Thomas Piketty, basically what does Thomas Piketty's book state? He says that, G is greater than R, I think is the ultimate equation that he came to, which is basically that the value of the return on money exceeds the value of the return on working, on labor. Okay. And so what this means is people who have capital ultimately will get richer, and people who have only labor will not. And if you even think moving forward into like a more automated society, into more with AI and things like this, what do you want? You want people to own assets. If people own assets, then they're in a situation where they can kind of benefit from those assets. If you look at that's the smart thing that Saudi Arabia is doing, right? Saudi Arabia said, hey, listen, we won't be able to rely on oil, so we're going to become like a giant Berkshire Hathaway. We're going to own a ton of assets, and our assets are going to provide for the wealth of our country going forward generations. If you look at what Norway has done with their sovereign wealth fund, right? They say, hey, listen, we're going to take the royalties income from our oil, we're going to plow it into what is now the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. We're going to buy assets, we're going to own property, we're going to...
What about China?
I mean, China is a whole different kettle of fish. China is very smart, but a different sort of thing. They have a lot of money, but it's in a different form.
Yeah.
They also have a different government structure. But anyway, so I think that having something where your people are sharing part of this ownership is important. And by the way, you could use this to dissuade foreign ownership as well, because you could say, hey, listen, we can do that domestically, but any foreign stuff we don't have the power to do that. So we're going to actually tax you on the value of your shares in that case. So you're actually going to have to come up with cash. Whereas this way you won't have to come up with cash. You don't even have to worry about it. We don't have to, that's it. Your shares are just being diluted. Very little amount, bit by bit over a lot of years.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
So I think that's an interesting idea. Do you have other interesting ideas?
I definitely don't have an idea like that. No. No, I mean that's very interesting. I'm pretty sure most people would hear that for the first time, probably. If not everybody. I would love to hear your thoughts, and so would Michael. And
tell me I'm an idiot, and I think you'd get a lot of pushback from certain sectors for sure. But if you just think like long term,
Well, you're an idiot.
I think that like probably a lot of people like there is a lot of reasons why this wouldn't work, right?
Yeah.
Like it is a radical idea. Like there's some other radical ideas that I have along this similar line, and I think we can play into this. Maybe this is a nice segue. So the bottom line is that you need some way to counteract deferral. Which, by the way, like there are other things you can do. There's something in the U.S. With something called foreign non-grantor trusts. They do something called throwback tax, and basically the way this works is a foreign non-grantor trust allows you to defer money when you shouldn't be allowed to based on all their other rules. And so to counteract that, they created something called throwback tax, which tries to undo the compounding effect.
Okay.
And it's very penalizing. And again, there's some ways around throwback tax, so that's a whole other conversation. But you could do something like that, right? You could say, okay, if you've held this asset for 20 years, then we're not just taxing you the capital gains at the end. We're basically compounding the effects of those gains over time, and we're taxing you more. And so there's, you can do wealth tax, you can do, these are a variety of different proposals. But I do think that it's important to understand, just, to me, anytime I discuss with people wealth and income inequality, I'm like, I don't think you can have this conversation without the context of understanding how wealth is built.
Yeah.
Because you want to look at what's going on structurally, and one of these things is these tax advantages, and you want to try and level that out for people. It's not a good system when you can consume a lot of resources, saving on taxes, and doing this. By the way, before we go on, just a thought that I had, which I really liked from Bill Gates, was Bill Gates pointed out, he's like, there's a difference between wealth and consumption. And I do think it's really worth delineating between these two. So, in my opinion, the person who basically, I don't know, they go out and they spend $2 million a night on bottle service should be taxed differently than the person who takes their wealth and spends it on, giving internet to people in third world countries.
Yeah.
And so that's where partly I think there's a moral justification for taxing consumption. And in particular, I think there should be much more progressive tax on different types of consumption. So let's use a specific example of this. Right now, all of Europe has VAT, right? Then you have sales tax in most US states. A lot of places in the world have some sort of sales tax, which is a form of consumption tax. Now, you also get vice taxes, like maybe on cigarettes, on gambling, on alcohol, on things like this. Okay, gasoline. Okay, fair enough. But usually there's maybe like two-ish rates. There's, loosely speaking, there's sometimes a lower rate for necessities, which I think there should be no tax on necessities, right? It's like, okay, if you're paying for lettuce, why should you get taxed on that? That's like what you need to live, right? Then there is their normal rate. So, maybe sometimes you have like medication or supplements will be in the lower rate. There's different, maybe diapers for babies or tax, however they figure that out, right? And by the way, there's some complications on like, how do you keep track of all this stuff, right? But in my opinion, luxuries should be taxed at extreme levels. So if you want to buy a Louis Vuitton purse, that's fine. My wife wants to buy Louis Vuitton purses, so I would be I can put my money where my mouth is on this. I think you should probably pay 70% tax. Like,
on top of the value of the product?
Yes. Yeah, your VAT rate, instead of being 20%, should probably be like 70%, maybe 100%. I don't know. Should be higher.
Jesus Christ.
Because, look, what are you doing? It's just frivolous consumption. And a great example of where they do this is on cars in Singapore. When you buy a car in Singapore, you're going to pay probably 4 times the value of the car. So the Lamborghini that costs $250,000 to $500,000 in America costs $1 to $2 million.
But they're trying to kill the incentive in Singapore. Would you want to kill the incentive in luxuries in general?
Probably. Like, I'm like, look, if you want to buy it, go ahead and buy it, but you're going to pay more for it.
Yeah.
Because it's frivolous. Like, do I want to incentivize people to doing frivolous spending? I don't really know that I do. I think that, so this is somewhere I haven't seen now. So let me give you the counter argument to this. For cars, it's quite easy, and for Singapore cars, it's quite easy. Because how do you drive a car in Singapore without paying this tax? You're basically screwed, right? So they control that very well. But if you're in, let's say, Germany, which, by the way, Denmark has a similar program, it's harder to do because now somebody can just drive in from Austria, right? You're like, okay, well, is that a car that you've paid this tax on? Well, it doesn't matter because you drove it in from Austria. It's not a German country. And so you incentivize people buying outside of the country and then bringing the vehicles in and pretending that it's foreign, you register it through a foreign company or something like that.
But then doesn't Singapore have like an import fee of sorts to equalize that?
So in Singapore, it's not like they're like an island basically. Like it's a little, so they're geographically constrained. So it's easy for them to control, right? It's a city state. But if you're Germany, where you have all these borders and stuff, it's very difficult to police that. Right? You could probably do it if you're UK, if you're Ireland, if you're Iceland for sure. Any of those types of places you can do it. But where it's like imagine between Canada and the US, And so you can say, all right, well, you have to have a local license plate, and if we see you driving in a restaurant. So Denmark has this, and Denmark will go quite harsh on you if you, say, brought a vehicle in from Germany and are driving this around. But now you have to apply a lot of policing to this. Is the policing going to be worth it? How does this all? It's a pretty complex process, right? So that's with vehicles. Now let's try thinking about doing luxury goods like Louis Vuitton bags. Well, here's what's going to happen. I already go shopping in Europe for these types of things as opposed to Asia because they're cheaper, right? So we're like, okay, great. They're produced locally. So if you want to go buy a Gucci bag in Italy, it's cheaper than a Gucci bag in Malaysia. It's just the way that things are because they have an import cost there. So I go, we save these types of shopping until we're in Europe. We go and we pay 20% less or something, right? Now imagine you tax me at 70% on that thing. Now I'm definitely going to do this. And now it's really hard for you to police this, right? Because the person just wears the bag into the country. How do you know that the duty was paid or not? Right? It's very difficult. So I don't think it's necessarily practical. I think there's something you have to figure out in there to say, okay, how do we manage this in a reasonable way? But just ideologically thinking more along progressive tax on luxury goods, I think it's a good mindset. It's I don't know exactly how maybe what you would do is you would say, okay, you pay for it with a credit card, and then the tax gets added at the credit card level. Something like that could happen maybe. I don't know. You'd have to figure it out. But just as a thought experiment, I think it's worth considering, okay, some goods should be taxed at a higher rate because, why should you have that thing? And at the same time, I think that you could probably flip it around and say, okay, you're going to give favorable treatment to certain types of investments. I think that, and this comes down to another part of wealth creation, so maybe we can talk about this, is, okay, where is wealth built? Wealth is built primarily in what you own, not in what you do, right? Okay, so now the question becomes, there's some investments that are really good for society. We want you to invest in those things. For instance, generally I would say startups are a good place to invest. Even if that startup is not successful, you probably burned up the money spending on people's wages and local things and stuff that recycles back into the system.
I think I have to take it a step back.
Sure.
It's what we were talking about right before, which is personal discipline on saving money. So if you don't have money, you can't invest in any startup. You can't invest in anything else. And the average person has no savings. I mean, let alone in the US, the average person has debt.
Yes.
So,
let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So I think there's two things to discuss about that. Well, maybe why don't you start talking to me about debt, because you're in the debt business. So you might have some
well,
some good insights.
I mean, so most people think that people accumulated debt by just being reckless, and I think that's very unfair. So, I mean, in the US in particular, there's the banks, the way that the way that they have structured the lending business is very predatory, right? So I can't really just blame the consumer for being in debt, but there's definitely a piece of lack of discipline and recklessness. I think it's definitely a piece of it. Now, most people, like in the ads that we run, for example, oh man, the comment sections are fun, right? People are just outright blaming it on the consumers. They're like, well, look, you got the money, you should pay for it.
Just so you guys know, they help people to get out of debt, and so
right,
it's the context of the comments.
I have a marketing business, and this is one of the industries that we're focused in. So basically, lots of people get in debt, but yeah, I think it would be great if people could make better decisions and be more careful about what they sign, right? Like when they get in when they get a loan, for example. Yeah,
So let's dissect this a bit, because I think there's actually I think the whole subject of debt. Like when I look at wealth inequality, I think, okay, there's inequalities in terms of taxes. I think there's inequalities in terms of education. I think there's inequalities in terms of debt. And there's a few others that I think we can cover as well. So when it comes to debt, I look at a few different things that I think are fairly important. So part of it is an education problem, right? The next is, I think, and actually there's a really cool, what is this company? Graham Stephan on his show just did something. He bought into this bank that gamifies savings. Do you know about this? Have you seen this?
No.
You know who Graham Stephan is?
Of course.
So yeah.
Great guy.
So he's into, Graham, you can come onto our show sometime and we'll have a good talk. Anyway, he's like really big on like finding the highest interest savings accounts, right? Which I think, by the way, is a total waste of time, Graham. Like, seriously, of all the things you're going to do. I mean, okay, it's fun, but it's a waste of time. The interest rates are so low. It's pathetic. Anyway, and so there's this bank in the US, I think it's called like Yada Bank or something. They're backed by Evolve Bank. Anyway, so what they did is, and there's a really successful program in the UK that also does this, where instead of paying high interest, based on the amount of money you have, they give you like points. Mm-hmm. And these points basically enter you into a lottery where you could win a big chunk of money, up to like $1 million or something.
Okay.
So why is this important? Because it kind of gamifies savings, okay? Because the thing is, it's not that, like, let's say that I put $1,000 in the bank. You give me 1%. That's $10 in a year. I'm not really that motivated for $10 in a year.
Yeah.
I'm much more motivated by getting some points where I could win $1 million, even if my chances are low. Like, people are more likely.
People do spend quite a bit of money on lottery
exactly.
tickets.
Yeah, so it's like free lottery tickets, and that's literally like you can watch. He did an episode on this. I watched it just recently. He liked it so much he invested in the company, and so very cool concept. But the point is, they gamified this process, right?
Well, okay. Going back to it though, yeah. This is not just credit card debt. What about the person that has cancer and they have to rack up the medical bills? Like, what about all those people? Like, somebody had an accident, the ambulance had to come pick them up, and you know.
The medical system's fucked.
Right.
We're going to do an episode on the medical system.
Right.
Sure.
No, but I'm saying that. Look, lots of people have medical debt and little to no credit card debt.
Sure.
And it's like, well, you can't really blame the person for getting sick.
Not.
Like, this is ridiculous.
Absolutely. No.
So
definitely part of the debt problem is a social structure problem.
Yes.
Right? Like, here's another one. Student loan. There's more student loan debt in the U.S. than
100%.
there is credit card debt. Now, what's criminal about that? You can't declare bankruptcy from student loan debt.
That's insane.
Unbelievable. Somebody will be retired.
You can die and it goes up.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's unbelievable. Like,
no, it's
basically the institutions that are giving you useless degrees should pay some of the financial penalty of you defaulting on that loan, and you should be able to declare bankruptcy.
Again, I'm going back to what I was saying, predatory lending.
Absolutely.
Not just the banks, but
100%.
Yeah, it's the whole educational
we
system.
We can go through all of these, absolutely. There was another one. So I just finished reading this book, Predictably Irrational. And he talked about looking at the psychology of how people spend and are there ways you could make people save more, right? Very interesting stuff. And so I think that if society took a view on, hey, look, this debt thing's a problem, there's all sorts of cool stuff we could do. Gamifying saving, right, for instance. Turning around and educating people better about debt, for instance. Turning around and allowing people to declare bankruptcy. Like, the fact that they got rid of declaring bankruptcy for student loans, outrageous. I'm not sure that you should be allowed to have student loans at all. That's a whole other conversation.
What about the thought that Elizabeth Warren had? Cancel them. I mean, that's just, it's crazy. You can't just...
Bernie Sanders had a similar thing. He was talking about like getting rid of it. I think part of the thing is, I think you have to pay attention to the incentives. And I think that over time the incentives tilt you in a certain direction. And so the question is, well, hang on, who pays the price for that? And if the banks all did this lending, and now all of a sudden, okay, the government just pays off that debt, the banks didn't lose anything by doing it, the students didn't lose anything, the universities didn't lose anything, nobody really lost anything. Basically, society just amortized that across society, right? And I don't think that that really addresses the root cause. So I'm much more interested in saying, well, what are the root causes going on here? And so I would start by looking at saying, hey, listen, you have a bubble in inflation, or an inflationary bubble in higher education. Okay, so what happens, I think, is, listen, you come in and your education should cost $2,000, but hey, we're going to lend you $4,000. Well, what does your education cost now? It costs $4,000. Why? Because the institutions know they can charge that. The government, the money is there for you to pay.
Yeah.
So now they say, okay, great. Well, we're going to lend you $6,000 because you know what? You need to pay for, some food and stuff during the school year. All right. Well, we're raising our education costs to $6,000. Why on earth do we live in a world where everything information related, the price has plummeted, but the price of higher education has gone up dramatically, like dramatically up? This is an outrageous concept. It makes no sense. And hopefully, kind of Corona and some things like this are going to help to shift. So a lot more people start saying, hang on a minute, why am I not just doing classes or YouTube videos online? I think you're also going to start seeing, Chamath from Social Capital is talking about this a little bit, about how it's like, look, your degree is useless. Like, it's really, we have all these people with useless degrees. I had a recruiting company for 7 years. I can tell you in engineering, which should be a pretty tangible subject, the people who own engineering companies would tell me, I can't, I have to give that person 2 years of on-the-job training before they're useful to me. Like, what? What did you just spend 5 years in university for?
Right.
That should have been your on-the-job training. This is outrageous.
Too much theory and no practice, though. Like,
it's total. Like, again, we'll do a
we're probably diving too deep into the
but the bottom line is
educational.
That you have this education debt problem, right? And I think that you should address the root causes of it. And part of that is giving people skin in the game. Like, okay, if you're a lender, would you lend some 18-year-old kid with no income $100,000? In no normal circumstance would you do that. Why are you doing it? It's because it's government backed.
Right.
And they can't default out of it.
Right.
So, hey, look, I'll lend you that money all day long. You want $1 million? Sign up. Let's go for it. 10 million? Let's go for it.
Yeah.
It's an outrageous situation. So you need to have some skin in the game where it's like, hey, look, they can suffer some economic loss. And, maybe the university says, hey, listen, we'll lend it to them. We'll finance you, knowing that we may not get as much fees if you default, right? Which is normally what happens. Like, I can go and I can finance you on, say I sell laptops or something, right? I can choose to finance you, and I might make more money because the interest rate, I could get more in the long run, but I might lose out. And I just have to know my math and figure that out and, build a sophisticated credit system and model this, etc. And then I think what you would get is, I think the market would decide that, hey, people who are doing degrees that are more likely to have a high-paying job at the other end will be more likely to get student loans than people who are doing stuff where they're going to get out and they're discover McDonald's is still hiring. And as a result, the market is going to tilt the allocation of resources within the marketplace to jobs that are and degrees that are more useful anyway. And on top of that, I think that universities, if there's less student loan money there, will be more incentivized to drive their costs down and be competitive, and that'll be better for everybody. Like, I think that's generally what should be happening, and I think there's a huge problem that that's not happening. So I think this comes back to some extent to this whole problem of corporatism, right? We're talking about capitalism when we don't really have that capitalistic a society so much as we have a corporatist society, right? You have a situation where there's companies that are too big to fail. You have a government that's going to provide a safety blanket, not for individuals. They're going to provide a safety blanket for corporations. That's outrageous. That defeats the whole purpose. Like, the entire concept of capitalism is that you can go bankrupt, that you can lose your investment. You say, hey, listen, I went into this, I failed, okay, I'm going to, take the hit. And this is going to create an environment of companies that are going to compete and figure out how to do it better, and off you go. But if you remove those incentives, you end up with a big problem.
Yeah.
And that problem has a lot of, and so that's what I think people like Elizabeth Warren don't get. Like, my judgment against people like that is they're well-intentioned, they're well-meaning, and they just don't understand how the system works and like what the underlying problems are that have led to this situation and aren't addressing those root causes. And it sounds really good to say, hey, listen, we've got however many millions of students who have a few $1 trillion of student loan debt, and let's just wipe it out, and everything will be easier. But I'm fearful that 20 years later you'll be back to a few $1 trillion of student loan debt.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the thing. When we talk about predatory lending, I don't think that payday loans should be allowed at all. I think it should be illegal. Basically what I would do is I would cap the interest rate. I would say if you can't make money lending at 24% a year, then you can't lend money.
Right.
No fees, no all this other stuff to inflate it. That's the situation. Because in my experience, I've seen good people who I've known, some people who have good jobs, etc., who they're kind of under pressure. They go and take the payday loan, and it's hundreds or thousands of percent over the course of the year. By the time you add up all these fees and all this kind of thing.
Yeah. And I've seen quite a few cases.
Yeah,
so.
And they never get out. And it's like, hang on a minute. If that person, my belief is that generally, if you hadn't taken that payday loan, you would have found some other way. In 90% of the cases, but it becomes this deadly cycle of every payday they're going to get a new payday loan. And it's like, this is unbelievable. Like, if you can't lend money and make money at 24% a year, you don't get to be in business.
I agree. I'm totally with you there.
Yeah.
So yeah, the educational system, we're gonna have to make another episode on this. There's quite a lot of.
And tell us what you guys think about debt too. If you notice some things that are problematic in the debt market. I will flip it around and look at the other side of debt though. So we're talking about hey, these are all bad things that hold people down. But the flip side is a lot of people get really rich off debt. Debt is a means of gambling where if it pays off, you win big. But your downside is limited to bankruptcy.
Are we talking about as a business getting a loan, or what do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, okay, let's look at the real estate example, right? Hey, listen, I can go and I can leverage up by, potentially 10-to-1 ratio, right? Depending, if you're really good, you can get 100% ratio by doing cashback vendor cashback mortgages and things like this. But basically, I go and I borrow a whole bunch of money to buy a bunch of assets, and so long as those assets pay off, my returns are potentially, magnified dramatically because I didn't have to put my own money in, right? The worst case scenario is it goes to zero and I lose. I'm like, okay, if I was personally guaranteed, I might lose whatever my assets are. But otherwise, there's some ways to protect against that anyway. I stand to win big. So it rewards a gambling culture, which I don't think is really good. But more importantly, I think that some of the counteraction to that I think should be in place, because this factors into inflated prices of real estate and things like that, is I don't think that you should be allowed to write off the interest on your mortgage. I think that should not be a valid expense.
Why?
I think that, again, you have this exasperated inequality that comes into play. And I think that you just, by allowing people to borrow money to buy a lot more and then turn around and write off the interest on that, they get a huge advantage that somebody else doesn't. And so you can look at it depending on where you are. Like in Canada, you can't write off your mortgage interest personally, but you can on an investment. So in the US, you can write it off on personally as well as on an investment. But just in general, I think why would you allow that? Why don't you just say, hey, listen, you can borrow money, that's fine, but just be aware your numbers have to work regardless because you don't get to write that off. That's that's on you to cover it. And I think what that would do, so this kind of comes back to the structural thing about where people are at. Look, part of the gap between rich and poor, in fact, I actually saw some study, supposedly the Piketty numbers. So basically Thomas Piketty showed how, there's this growing gap between rich and poor, and he accounted for that by this difference in capital. Supposedly, if you can control for the cost of housing absorbs most of that.
Really?
Yeah. So what this implies to me is, hey, you better do something about the housing situation.
Are we talking about just the US or are we talking about globally?
I don't know. I would have to go and look at the study. I'm not sure. But it's not surprising to me. Listen, most people, I don't know, it's 6% of Americans are millionaires or something like that, net worth. But most of that is value in their house, right? Somebody buys a house, it's a great little wealth building thing that has happened for them for a long period of time. But now exaggerate that and say, hang on, you realized this, that, hey, look, most people are getting rich off their home. Why don't I buy 6 homes? And I can do that with virtually no money down, right? So great, I save up a small amount of money. Maybe I borrow a little bit from friends for down payment. I go and I buy. The prices of houses have doubled approximately every 10 years since, the 70s, or something like this. I don't think that trend will continue, by the way. It's a whole other conversation. But, basically I get to benefit and ride this, and I'm way ahead of all these other people. Why? Well, because, I was willing to gamble a little bit more, because I was willing to own these assets. And then at the same time, what's happened? People who are just getting started have a really hard time becoming homeowners. So young people, like if you look at wealth inequality, what you're going to find is that wealth inequality correlates really highly to age. Young people are poor, generally. Older people are well off.
Yeah.
Makes sense because you have a bunch of years to accumulate and things like this.
Sure.
Right? Also, your skill set isn't as high, so when you start out with your career, your wages are going to be lower, then they're going to get higher. But what's happened is it used to be, and I think this provided a lot of stability to society, was people owned a house, they would live with their parents, they would inherit something from their family, the government would give it to them when you're talking about socialist countries, etc. Like, having your place gave you stability. It kind of provided a minimum base level where you're at. But now, it's really hard to get into homeownership because the prices of houses are so high, right?
Yeah.
If the average price of a house in the neighborhood that you're in is $500,000, how do you get into that when you're starting out? So, what has happened is that increasingly, like we're in Eastern Europe right now, Eastern Europe traditionally was not a culture which believed a lot in credit, in debt. But increasingly they have to, because how else are they going to afford to buy a house? And the problem is you get this deadly cycle, because the more people borrow money to buy houses, the more the price of houses goes up, which means the more people have to borrow money to buy houses, until suddenly you get the whole society leveraged to 40%.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's definitely a whole cycle there.
yeah, so I think that one of the things that if you're looking at wealth inequality that you need to be addressing is how do you keep housing prices low? Like you basically if you want your lowest common denominator of society to be doing pretty well, then you have to look at what are subsistence needs. Your subsistence needs are food, shelter, education, healthcare, housing, transportation. So what do you start saying? You say, okay, well, food, all right, we can remove sales tax on food, things like that. In theory, you have pretty competitive markets there, so that should drive costs down. Now, the nutritional quality of that food is questionable, and maybe you should play with that. Okay, I think there's some things that we can have a whole conversation on that. I think that's worth looking at. Education, I think that Norway has done a pretty good job in terms of they have a very egalitarian education system, which is good. It kind of is an equalizer, and it's all free, right down to the pencils, which is good. The costs of it, you can play, they're one of the highest, they spend some of the most out of any country on education. So, okay, you can play around with that a little bit. I think that, you eliminate the debt effects on there. You encourage the adoption of technology. Sweden has done some stuff where all the schools are private and they compete for this funding and things like that. So they have incentives to drive costs down. Okay, there's things you can do there. You look at medical, obviously, you should be providing a base level of medical for people because it's just in the best interest of society. But you have a cost problem. So you have to say, okay, well, how do we deal with that? Again, we'll do a whole video on medical system because that's super complex. But you want to do something to make it so that people are not going to end up in the situation you're talking about. Hey, I had to take an ambulance and now I'm in debt. And now that debt is compounding and so on. So, okay, you have that. What else have we got? Transportation. Transportation is an interesting one. You want to try to drive the cost of public transit down. You primarily probably have to do that through good urban planning. That's a big problem in a bunch of places. The urban planning is bad. And in a lot of cases now what we're trying to do is we're trying to tax fuel because we want to dissuade people from going out and creating greenhouse gases and things like this. So that drives up the cost of transportation. So you have to kind of try and figure something out there. And people in rural areas are hurt more by that than people in urban areas. So, okay, there's something you can play around with there. Then, what else have you got? So, well, you come down to housing, right? And what's the deal with housing? As far as I'm concerned, the deal with housing is you want to be able to add a lot of supply to the market to keep housing costs down. What does this mean? Well, you probably need urban planning guidelines that require, that mandate certain minimum density, right? Just, hey, listen, you have to be able to have X number of people per block or you're not allowed to build. And then you have to make it fairly accessible to get building permits because if people can't build, it's really hard. Like in California, it's insanely difficult. Not surprising, they have a housing homelessness problem there, right? Say, okay, great, like all the environmental regulations you have to go through to be able to build, the hassles of paying for the permits, that like it's just an insanely difficult thing. Then you probably need landlord-tenant acts that don't penalize the landlords. So this is a huge problem because you start saying, okay, well, you can't kick somebody out if they don't pay rent. Hang on a minute. Well, then why would I rent to anybody who I think might want to, like, might default?
Yeah.
Right? So then what you do is you say, well, it's not worth it to build for low-income housing because we're going to get screwed. So we better build for high-end people, or we better build short-term housing where we're doing it like for Airbnb or something like that, which is going to force your prices up for everybody else. And you say, well, why are you forcing, hey, we don't want you to be renting to short-term people. Well, then incentivize us to rent to long-term people, right? So you need to adjust those landlord-tenant rules. And I think if you were to do that, and then, make it a little bit less of an attractive investment for people to go and like have all this investment capital pushing up the prices, then all of a sudden you're caught. Like, in my opinion, one of the things we should be doing is we should be focusing on trying to drive the cost of living down for average people in society. There's a lot of talk about raising minimum wage. Fuck raising minimum wage. Lower the cost of living. Instead of saying, hey, listen, let's go from $10 an hour to $15 an hour, let's make $10 an hour livable. What do we have to do to do that? Well, these are kind of the things that people have to pay for. We already know that electronics have gotten cheap. That's not a problem, right? But food seems to have gone up in price. Transportation,
I don't know. People think that, like, to thinking on what you just said. Well, yeah, if you made the $10 an hour livable, that wouldn't make the rich any poorer. It would just help them.
But does $15 an hour make the rich any poorer?
No, but the average person that suggests that idea suggests that because they think they will just keep more money in the bank and therefore they'll be able to just have a higher net worth and,
But so if you have to spend less of your disposable income on living versus making more, what's the difference?
I know. But I'm saying I don't think it will address the billionaire is not going to become any less rich. I think most people want the billionaires to, like I said, there is that expectation that you have to put back to society, and that's where the idea stems from, I think. It's not just, hey, I just want to make more money. It's, I think if your company is making billions of dollars, you should redistribute it by better wages, so the minimum wage should be higher. I think that's the basic idea. Whereas, I'm totally with you. Yeah. Or probably...
my counter argument to that would be you're incentivizing people to send jobs overseas, which,
I totally understand.
As
a business owner, yes,
yeah, exactly.
Why you would want to pay the $2 an hour instead of $10 or $15 an hour.
Yeah, exactly. And the more that you force me to have those costs go up, the more I'm going to want to send jobs overseas. Now, some jobs I can't, right? Restaurants or something like that. So great, you get those ones penalized. The price of your food goes up at restaurants, and then what happens? Like, I think that it's interesting to me that the supposedly best examples of countries that work well in a kind of an egalitarian way are the Scandinavian countries, and none of them have minimum wage. Mm-hmm. Almost everywhere else has minimum wage, but those are the ones that supposedly work best, and they don't have minimum wage. So what kind of gives there? Now, the way that they deal with that to some extent is they have collective bargaining agreements and things like this, right? They basically have unions, and so the unions kind of help to mitigate that. But the bottom line is, I think that you want to make the basics very affordable for your people. Mm-hmm. Like, that makes everybody's life better.
Oh, I totally understand why.
Why wouldn't you want to have the costs go down? I think that in general we have a huge problem in society that there is far too much focus on increasing budgets to spend more as opposed to driving costs down. I think it's the problem with the medical system. Huge argument I make with people is I'm like, look, I don't think we have a problem of whether the government pays or the private sector pays. When you're spending 18% of GDP on healthcare, which is basically double what the next most expensive, there's a couple exceptions, but basically every other country spends on healthcare, and you get worse medical outcomes. The problem is not how much money you're spending.
It's how you spend it.
Exactly. If you were to just reduce the cost by 50%, then we'd have lots of money to give everybody else healthcare.
Yeah.
So And by the way, Singapore spends 4% on GDP and has some of the best healthcare in the world. So, do not tell me that it can't be done. Every other country on the planet is doing it. And you're not doing it. Picking on the US here. The truth is Canada doesn't do an amazing job. Lots of places don't do an amazing job, right? So I think that's just like the wrong mindset. I think people need to be way more focused on efficiency of spending.
Yeah.
And, so
in general, right? Like as a rule of thumb, like you should be more disciplined, which is how we started this whole conversation. But yeah, I mean, there are all those other forces at play, like in countries like in the US, things that we were just talking about, predatory lending and, the payday loans and all those different temptations in the average person's life that, if they make that decision, they're,
So I do want to talk about a bit of kind of this other part of what you're saying, though, which is like, hey, listen, the billionaires should have less.
Yeah.
So I think there's a few things here.
It's a thing that people say, right? When they
Some
address
people
wealth
say
inequality.
Literally, there are a lot of people who say billionaires should not be allowed to exist. It should be illegal to be a billionaire. We should tax them out of existence.
I totally disagree with that idea.
I do as well. But I think it's worth looking at, again, the structural issues behind what's going on with this wealth inequality, right? So, all right, fair enough. You think that billionaires should, well, let's talk about like how do you address some very extremely wealthy people, okay? I think the first thing is you want to incentivize them not to spend money on things that are not good for society.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the tendency of billionaires is to primarily put their money into assets designed for wealth preservation and growth.
Do you think there should be any sort of regulation that, guides them on how to spend the money or forces them on spending their money?
I think the government is really bad at making those types of decisions.
Yeah.
And so I think the market should decide. But a few things here. Number one is I think that they should be incentivized to put money into small-scale research.
Small-scale research?
Well, startups. Because I think fundamentally investing in startup ecosystem, that's where innovation happens. I think innovation drives progress in society. When I look at the difference between life today versus in 1700, I think our lives are way fucking better.
Absolutely.
And I think that is 98% because we've advanced in technology. Not because politicians are so great, not because of social activists, not because of whatever. I think it's primarily because of technology. So the logical conclusion that I come to from that is we should be working on advancing technology.
Absolutely.
And where does technology tend to advance? It doesn't tend to be in large enterprises. It tends to be in small startups, which are disruptive, right? So we want to put money into there. So let's take a look at some of the things that I think become problems here. Number one, I like throwing out radical ideas because I think it's good for our conversation. So
absolutely.
Hopefully it stimulates the idea. Maybe these are bad ideas. The thing that I'm going to say is that for any one of these ideas I'm throwing out that I say is a radical idea, there's good reasons not to do it, okay? That's why it's radical. Hopefully it's going to stimulate somebody, and maybe you guys can give some ideas, to think about something where they can say, hey, look, yeah, your idea has a bunch of flaws, but here's how we could take the seeds of that and transplant it into something better.
We should encourage people once again to leave their comments down below and
subscribe. Subscribe to the channel.
Besides subscribing, we want you guys engaged in the conversation. It will help us figure out how to articulate our thoughts here on the podcast better as well.
Yep.
So feedback and your thoughts, please.
So here's a radical idea. You should not be allowed to have public companies.
Okay. Why?
I think that public companies mostly are really bad for society and really bad for exacerbating these wealth trends.
Okay. What you were talking about just before? That, look, the Mark Zuckerberg, for example, he didn't have the same role in Facebook as he did in the beginning that
not really,
he does now.
Because he would still have that. He would like if Facebook grew big, he would still have that. Okay, so and we can go and examine why public companies exist, and there's some merit to that. But here's the thing that I look at. Okay, first of all, the incentive structure behind public companies is really bad for business owners who become successful to do good. Mm-hmm. Here's why: you have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize profit for the shareholders. People bought into that company because they want to make profit.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
What this means is that Mark Zuckerberg might be sitting there saying, hey, look, I don't need us to make more profit. I've already got a lot of money. So let's focus on doing good instead. He legally cannot do that. He legally is required to maximize shareholder value. Okay? This is a horrible thing. If he's the shareholder, if it's a private company, a handful of them, they're all like, hey, we're all rich. Who gives a shit? Let's look at a simple example. The movie The Social Dilemma. Okay? The movie The Social Dilemma, for those of you who haven't seen it, check it out. Good movie.
Netflix.
Yep. They basically talk about how Facebook is really bad for people. It's highly addictive, and it creates polarization. And the reason for this is because Facebook's algorithms are designed to maximize your time on the page. They want to keep you engaged. And it turns out that what keeps you engaged is showing you radical, divisive stuff. And so their algorithms are just going to keep showing you the stuff that's really not good for you, really not good for society, because it maximizes ad revenue. That's it. So what could Mark Zuckerberg, in theory, do? He could say, hey, look, we see that this is a problem. We don't want our product to be bad. We're going to modify the algorithm to instead create what's good for people. But it's going to mean we're going to make less ad revenue. Well, that's a non-starter. He can't do that. He cannot do it legally because he doesn't have that. Even though he's in a situation where he's like, hey, I have enough money. I'm worth close to $100 billion, right? I'm happy to take the hit. I'm okay with it. I think it would be good for society. He cannot do it. So I think that's a bad thing right off the bat with public companies. Second of all, so the idea behind a public company, in theory, is two things. One is that it gives access to public market finance, right? So the company can grow. But the truth is that only happens at the IPO, or through private placements afterwards. When you're buying and selling shares, that money's not going to the company. You're not financing the growth of that company. All you're doing is buying a share from somebody else so they make or lose money so that you can hopefully make or lose money in the future. So I would rather that people are putting their money through private investments in things like angel investing, venture capital, etc., where the money's actually going to the company, actually paying expenses for R&D, for growth, etc., and helping to advance something, right? The other thing that happens is it facilitates liquidity events for the shareholders who are kind of stuck in that company, right? So they say, okay, great, I've been holding on to these shares for a long time, it's good for me, but the truth is I want to be able to get my money out and move on, right? Well, I would say, all right, let's go and allow a certain maximum number of people to buy in. And what does that do? It keeps valuations low, and it forces companies to focus on making money through profit rather than through increase of shares, which I think is also a good thing. You don't really want companies that in the long run are not profitable. You want companies to be making, people should be making their money as shareholders from the profits of the company, not from, hey, this company is losing money perpetually. And it's okay to lose money for a while, right? It's normal that companies don't make money for the first couple of years or whatever. But you can essentially do that forever, right? You can just say, hey, I'm going to profit off the volatility of the company. This company may never be profitable. It's like, okay, well, then that's fine. But should the shareholders be making money if that's the case?
Yeah, I understand.
So I think the whole incentive structure is wrong. And, again, so why is this a bad thing? Well, first of all, shareholder value would decrease a lot, right? And I think that's actually a good thing, right? Because I'm saying, hey, listen, if shareholder value is decreasing a lot, then that exasperation between rich and poor is less, right? How much less would Facebook be worth not in a public company? I can give you some exact numbers. Chamath, again, founder of Social Capital, is doing these things called SPACs right now. Okay, it's kind of a big wave. And so these are basically where he takes companies and he puts them into public vehicles and brings them to the public market. And the idea is that by doing this, a few things can happen. One is more retail shareholders can participate in the growth of the company. And second of all, it makes it so that they can access capital at a much higher multiple, basically. So to give you some idea, maybe the multiple of a company would be 10x ARR, that's annual recurring revenue on, say, a SaaS company. But in the public market, maybe it's worth 30 times, right? So now this is good for if they're raising capital because they aren't getting diluted as much, right? So there's something to be said for that. But the point is just look at how much bigger the valuations are. So we want to try and keep the valuations down, right? Because that exasperates this problem. Now, the counter argument to this is, well, great, then I'm just not going to start my company in the US or wherever it is that they bring in this rule. I'm going to go do it in Hong Kong, and I'm going to go public on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange instead. And so you do have this, you have to figure that out. And so this idea probably isn't the optimal idea, but I wanted to throw it out as a radical idea to kind of like get people thinking about another way.
You need just more than just one country taking place in something like this.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, because we're getting very deep in other subjects, I want us to take a few steps back here to go back to the core subject. I wonder how the universal currency, universal income would...
Universal basic income?
Yeah.
Yep.
But it's also universal currency, isn't it? Isn't it, or is it a separate idea that everybody would have exactly the same currency?
Two separate ideas.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the universal basic income then.
Yep.
Do you think that would help close the gap?
I think actually it would probably be much worse.
Mm.
And the reason I think that is because I do think it's very important, like we started by talking, the factor of productivity. And I think that over the long period of time, universal basic income will erode productivity. I think that there may be some short-term benefits from it. I have a friend who is, he and I had dinner here a few weeks ago, and we were talking, he's a developer, and so we were talking a little bit about all the development languages that came out of Denmark. He's Danish. I was like, how did that happen? And his perspective to me was that, hey, listen, they have a strong social safety net there. That's good. That social safety net allowed people to take some risks and be innovative, but that over time, it increasingly allows people to be lazy. Mm. So at first, when you're not used to it, this is one of the things that I think is a flaw in kind of the studies and perspectives on UBI. Mm-hmm. The studies and things...
UBI?
University.
Yeah, okay.
So the argument is, hey, listen, people don't stop working, right? And I think that's largely true because societally we are used to doing it a certain way. But fast forward 20 years, I think that how it affects your behavior might be quite different than how it affects your behavior immediately. So that's one thing that I think is concerning. Second of all, I think that it's not really a very good allocation of resources. I was literally talking to Tiana on our way over here, talking about it, is, in my view, I look at it as there are some people who don't need anything. So why would you give them money? Then there's other people who need quite a bit more. So why wouldn't you give them more? Mm. I believe in the idea of having strong safety nets. I think that's important. I think that your healthcare should always be taken care of. I think we should have egalitarian healthcare. I think that you should be able to have some means of earning income if things get rough for you, right? Like there should be
unemployment, like most countries.
Or like one of the things that's been suggested by the modern money theory people, Warren Mosler, et cetera, is a federal job guarantee, right? So they say, okay, great. If you're unemployed, we're at least going to provide you with some sort of a job that you can go into. And I think there's tons of these that we could do, right? Like, and so the idea is you'd be paid basically a minimum wage, and that you could get hired out of there by companies. So he has a whole model for it. You can look up Warren Mosler. He talks about it quite a bit. And I think it's an interesting idea. Like we should have a basic net. And I think there's a lot of things increasingly that you could put people towards. For instance, elderly care, right? Because a lot of things, okay, maybe they're too technical, maybe you can't. It's like, okay, well, there's increasingly you have an aging population. There's increasingly need for people to just be with people, take care of them, you know. Probably providing assistance from an educational standpoint, right? Providing a broader base of support for students. You know, I wouldn't mind if it's like, okay, great, you're unemployed. During the time you're unemployed, you can make $10 an hour going and doing this. And you have an unlimited ability to do that. Okay, great, you know. That to me, and then if you actually are somebody who's really in need, you know, like a friend of mine has a bunch of health problems, right? So it's like, okay, great, well that's different. We're gonna provide you with extra stuff because that's the situation that you're in. But that shouldn't be the situation for most people. I think that thinking towards, okay, how do we optimize productivity is better than simply giving money. And yeah, I just think that just giving money over the long period of time, I believe, will cause us to stagnate. I might be mistaken about that.
Do you think that the productivity factor, that component is far greater than education?
What do you mean?
Okay, so is it more important for somebody to have this basic education that we were just talking about, taxes, business and stuff like that? Or is it a bigger component that they should be more productive in business and that increases their chances so much more? Not just in business, in their workplace, generally speaking. And that would help them, you know, rise in the financial world.
I mean, look, I don't think that education is fundamentally nearly as important as is purported.
Productivity, or no?
As purported, yeah. So there's some research that suggests that actually boosting education broadly is not really very effective in terms of helping a country out. What it does is it basically helps people to preserve a certain level, but it doesn't really boost the. Basically, what happens is you end up with increasing costs in education, and the reason for that, no matter what, even if you don't have higher costs of education on like a per year basis, is that you get education inflation because more people are pursuing the higher education, and so employers just start demanding higher education.
Yep.
It's not really that effective. Now, very specific education maybe, but I think like productivity is really important. I did a video a little while ago where I talked about kind of the qualities that I see as helping you to differentiate in the world today. And one of them I think is just execution bias. Like there's just a lot of people who sit there and they can talk, look at us talking. And you know, I think you can spend a lot of time getting educated, and it doesn't mean shit if you're not getting shit done. And so, like, really,
we are two people that are getting shit done, that are talking, and this talk and putting this podcast together is part of execution. So.
Well, and hopefully, I mean, part of the idea is that through this we help to generate some ideas that hopefully, some collective efforts execute on, right? I think that you have to throw out some ideas to start off with to
exactly
kind of incubate or whatever, start gestating ideas. Right?
Yes.
So, anyway, in my opinion, like, we should be placing far more emphasis as a society on getting shit done, on trying shit, on all that kind of
It's
stuff.
why Jordan Peterson says, when you wake up, the first thing you should do is make your bed. Right? Like, and
I'm guilty of not doing that.
no,
but it makes sense. Yeah.
I didn't hear it from Jordan. I heard it from some sergeant. I don't know, somebody in the military that was suggesting that, and I started doing it. And I mean, I've been doing this for many years now, and it's great.
Cool.
But Jordan Peterson more specifically says that you should clean your room. If you can clean your room, how can you expect to do all those other things? And you should, he makes it in a framework, you should always strive to do something, get shit done. It's well, you don't even clean your room, then what the fuck?
Yeah.
And I mean, there is something.
In order, sort of thing.
Yeah, there is something to be said for that. But so. I would like us to recap a bit on all the different.
I also have some notes too, so I'm going to check and see how we've done at covering these.
I would like to recap just very quick on all the problems that we've identified onto why wealth inequality exists, right? So I mean, and I might just go through them a little broadly, but help me here.
Yeah, go for it.
So personal responsibility is definitely one of them. Being responsible, being more disciplined, that's definitely one. Being access to education and being more educated about. Though I know you said that it doesn't always help. Well, look, would it be the same if everybody knew about credit, taxes, all this type of stuff? What are some others?
Taxes.
Yeah, which is in the education side,
but
right?
the point is that it's not just, I think, about education. There are fundamental inequalities within the tax system.
Okay.
Just like I would say that there are actually fundamental inequalities within the education system, which is also a problem, right? If you're, and again, so this is where, say, Norway does a better job of it, but if you're in a country like, say, the US, where you can afford to go to a good private school versus somebody who can't, you have an advantage. That's just the way that it goes.
Yeah.
And so equalizing education, I think, is a valuable effort. I think similar, we're talking about with respect to debt, but also just in terms of access to healthcare, et cetera. If you're somebody who can be healthy, either because you have access to good food and somebody else does not, you have an advantage.
Yeah.
This is not an advantage that we want people to have, right? I want you, if you're going to work harder than the next person, great. If you're going to be more resourceful than them, great. This is good for us, right? But it's a bad situation where it's hey, look, you beat the other guy because he couldn't afford good food and you could. That's shitty. That's a
Yeah.
horrible thing for society. That's like
Yeah.
a terrible place to be. You know? Same thing, hey, look, well, you know, he got hit by a car and you got hit by a car, but you got the best healthcare treatment and you didn't go into debt. And he couldn't get the good, so he had a screwed up leg, was limping for the next few years, and he was in debt trying to pay for it. So that's why you beat him. Horrible reason to beat him. Like,
I agree.
we want you to beat him because, or vice versa, because you came up with better ideas. You innovated faster. You worked better with people. You you did things.
You
to add
contributed more value, exactly. To the society.
Exactly. If that's the case, great. So so that would be like another form of inequality that exasperates wealth inequality.
Okay. All right. So other than that, what else? What else did we add here?
So, I mean, we touched a little bit on, and I think it was important. I kind of mentioned a little bit about how wealth is built through ownership, and so some people learn to own, and some people don't own, and the effects of debt. Right, debt is a big one.
How you spend your time and how you allocate your time on a day-to-day basis.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of the responsibility one, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, if we put them under these umbrellas, then yeah.
So let me throw another one out though that we haven't talked about, which should be criminal, and it's going on right now. Are you aware of like what's happened with the stimulus in the U.S.?
I mean, that's a pretty broad question.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Apple's stock has tripled since 2018. Do you know why that is?
Why?
That is because, so let me point out to you, Apple's profits have basically not gone up in that time. In fact, I think they're down 5%, okay? But their stock is up 3 times. Why is their stock up 3 times? Because they've been buying back their own shares. Okay? All right, fair enough. You know, I don't know that it's a great idea to allow share buybacks, but let's just say that it's not the end of the world. But it starts to get worse. They bought back shares using debt. Okay, they borrowed money to buy back shares. All right, so you're making the company less healthy, but you're driving up the stock
Devaluation,
price,
yeah.
which looks really good. Tim Cook, great guy, all this stuff, but really, but now it gets far worse. This is the part where I think it should be criminal. What's really happening is the Federal Reserve has basically gone beyond their charter. They've set up a special purpose vehicle or special purpose vehicles with BlackRock, and
What is BlackRock?
BlackRock is like the biggest investment fund in the world. Okay,
Oh well.
and they're buying corporate bonds. Okay, so they're stimulating the economy by buying corporate bonds. So really, what is happening is Apple is selling bonds at close to zero interest, which the Federal Reserve is buying. That's how they're able to sell them. And then Apple is taking that money and buying back their own stock. Basically, the Federal Reserve is financing Apple to buy their own stock and drive their share price up.
That's nuts.
It's fucking ridiculous. So when a lot of people come to me and they say, oh, we should be taxing the rich, I'm like, really? Maybe you should just stop corporate welfare. If you just stopped corporate welfare, I feel like, who are the people who benefit from that? Well, Warren Buffett's one of the largest shareholders of Apple. Does Warren Buffett need the money? Fuck no, he doesn't.
Yeah.
Tim Cook, does he need the money? No. Like, start running down the list. The people who are benefiting are people who shouldn't be benefiting. On top of that, does Apple need this money? Like, does Apple need a bailout? No.
It's what you were saying. It's what capitalism is there for.
Yeah.
Like if you're gonna do.
Besides that, like, Apple's a well-run company. Apple's making a ton of money. So why does the federal government need to be involved, or the Fed, the central bank, need to be involved in stimulus? I understand when you're like, okay, hey, listen, the cruise ship industry is going to go under if we don't put some money into there, because in reality, we shut everything down because of COVID. All right.
The hotel industry, the airline.
Yeah, I understand in cases where it's like, look, this is actually a well-run business, but we fucked things up with, all this stuff. If you come to me and you say, hey, listen, I'm ordering you to close your business for the next few months, I'm like, look, okay, I understand the public health risks, I understand all this kind of stuff, but you better fucking compensate me for it, because I was running a good business. Do I deserve to go under because of this thing? No.
Totally not.
But Apple is not that company.
Yeah.
Like,
I understand, and I'm sure Apple is not the only company that has utilized.
This is tons and tons, and so get corporate welfare out of here. And where you're talking about, like, hey, get those billionaires not to be billionaires so much. Well, again, like,
you're not looking at the real problem. I get it, man.
Yeah.
No, makes sense.
Yeah,
makes sense.
So I think that's a thing that it should be criminal, what is happening. It's unbelievable. It's totally and absolutely asinine, and it is exasperating this wealth dramatically. Like they're talking, I don't know if you saw the thing in the debate the other day with Trump and Biden, where they're saying, okay, Trump is arguing we have a V-shaped recovery and Biden's arguing we have a K-shaped recovery.
Yes.
I'd never heard K-shaped recovery before. Had you heard that?
No.
Basically what it means, for those people who don't know, is it's K. It means that rich people are benefiting and poor people are losing.
Oh, I see.
And so that's the argument, is, well, it's not really a V because it's not benefiting. Oh, there's a whole bunch of people who are losing out. And, okay, you know what? They're actually right. Like, that's true. There are a bunch of people who are really being hurt, and there's a bunch of people who are doing really fucking well. And they shouldn't be doing like that. Okay, look, like you're going to have some winners and losers, all right? Like you will always have that. But
Trump is basically saying that the stock market and the economy go hand in hand,
yes.
where Joe Biden is saying it's not true, right?
Yeah, basically there's a certain portion of the people who own stocks, and those people are benefiting from it, and people who don't own stocks aren't benefiting from it. Meanwhile, you have 100,000 small businesses that have gone out of business. You know, you've got a lot of people who have lost their jobs, etc. Like, this is exasperating that inequality.
Yeah.
And so the way to address that, to me, is to take away the corporate welfare and to reallocate those resources. Again, I'm in favor of stimulus. I think that, like, look, in Canada, they gave people $2,000 a month for, you know, I think until now, like for months and months and months, they've been giving them $2,000 a month. Look, if you're I think there's some problems with how they've done it, but by and large, if you lost your job and, you know, we're saying, hey, listen, you lose your job, okay, great, we're going to give you $2,000 a month until we get through this. Like, I'm
not so sure about this,
okay,
though.
Great.
In the U.S., they did something similar, right?
So $1,200, like 3 times or something like that. So a lot less money.
Yes,
yeah.
Less money than in Canada.
Way less.
Right.
Way less.
Aren't you incentivizing people not to work when they can?
I think over the long term, you're not. In the short term, yeah.
Yeah. I'm talking about in the short term. As long as the stimulus is active,
yep.
You're incentivizing people to just quit.
Sure. But the reality, though, on the flip side, most of the time you're not incentivizing people to just quit because most people wouldn't make that much money anyway. Like, you're giving them a very base level. And if they quit, are they going to be able to get their job back? And you're in a situation where it's like, okay, like, if it's for a few months, how destructive is it really?
I don't know, man. You would be surprised. I've read so many stories since those stimulus packages came out. I definitely know one person that quit because of this. And
there are some people who have quit. Or there are businesses that have said to their employees, hey, I'll lay you off just because it'll be better off for you over the next while when things are slow, that you'll get this money as opposed to doing it the other way. Yeah, I mean, look, okay, you could flip it around and do it another way. Say, hey, listen, which, again, so there's a program in Canada where basically if your revenues dropped, they will pay, I think it's 75% of your payroll during this time, which ironically, you know, a friend of mine's company made more money than they ever did because they got $1 million from the government for this. But, you know, that's, you know, but I would say something like, okay, great, we'll incentivize you to keep people employed. You know, great, do it that way, right? Instead of saying people are unemployed, but some of them are going to be unemployed anyway, right? Like, some businesses are going to go under. Like, imagine you're Zara, your store is closed for a few months. What are you going to do with those people? Like, the store, you know, do you just allow those people to make nothing? That sounds really horrible.
Well, the U.S., they introduced this whole PPP program or whatever it is. This
PPP loans, yeah.
Right. So, well, if you lay off your staff, you can't forgive your So they did give plenty of incentive there.
Yeah, I mean, listen. To be fair, and I remember Mark Cuban was talking about this at the time. Was like, there's some moral hazard to giving out this money, right? Meaning that there will be some people who will abuse it. And it was like, look, at this point in time, at that point in the crisis, it was more important to get money to people quickly so that they wouldn't be destitute than it was to try and make sure people wouldn't get money that they didn't deserve and things like this, right? It's like,
and that makes sense.
Yeah, it's just like, the moral hazard is worth it. Like, we're just going to take it on. We're going to deal with it. But my point is just that I think that the funds that you're allocating basically to big corporations should be allocated to the normal people. And then those people can spend that money into the system. And with some notable exceptions, such as airlines, where it's just like, hey, we've just killed your business.
Right.
Like,
industry.
Yeah, the whole industry, right? Yeah, it's just like industry-wide, you're screwed.
Yeah.
And I mean, they did some stuff. I don't know how it actually played out, but say in the cruise ship industry, they couldn't qualify if they weren't American companies, and so some of them were like flagged out of Bahamas or stuff like this, so they couldn't end up getting it. So, I think, okay, great, like, we're going to set a precedent that you better relocate to America because, we don't like that you're flagging yourself out of some zero-tax Caribbean country and not contributing to our country. Like, okay, I think that's a fair argument. Like, we're not going to support foreign companies in this. But the bottom line is just there's a lot of corporate welfare, and the corporate welfare should stop. There are many, many ways in which corporate welfare is taking place. Now, I might separate out a little bit, like, okay, they have incentives for buying electric cars, which is kind of corporate welfare to Tesla. I think that's kind of okay because there's an unpriced negative externality in the cost of oil anyway. But for instance, the oil industry benefits tremendously from basically military presence in the Middle East, which secures cheap oil. And the price of oil should be a lot higher, but they're basically artificially driving it down through trillions of dollars of military spending. Like, this is imbalancing the economics here. And so yeah, like I'm just very against corporate welfare. I think that generally speaking, shareholders should take a hit. I think that if you wanted to bail out, you should in some cases do bail-ins. Bail-ins is where they they basically buy a share of the company. They're like, okay, great.
The government does?
Yeah. Yeah, so basically the government says, okay, great. You need money to get through. You need $5 billion. All right, you're going to issue shares, and we're going to buy the shares at current market value, which is cheap right now because the company's on the verge of bankruptcy, right? If you think like the cruise ship companies dropped by like 80% or something, right? So okay, great. We'll go and buy shares at that price, and that'll be a capital influx. It'll allow you to get through, but we're also going to benefit going up.
Yeah.
So we're going to get repaid as, society will get back what society put in. And why shouldn't they?
Fair enough. How many hours have we been going for?
Not very long, I don't think. I bet you we've been going for maybe like an hour and a half or something like that.
Oh, no, buddy.
Oh, no, buddy. I can tell you.
We're for sure going for 2 hours.
No, I guarantee you we're not. I 100% guarantee you.
We're going to make our first bet here on camera.
Perfect. We're having a bet. All right, what are we betting?
I don't know. You tell me. Okay.
Well, hang on. I might be wrong.
You're wrong.
Yeah, I think you might be right. I miscalculated something. I was thinking about the time, and I'm like, hang on a minute. No. Yeah, you might be right. Be right. Okay.
No, but it's definitely been an interesting...
it's an interesting discussion. Well, let's kind of summarize with hopefully some solutions, because this is the Solutions Podcast.
Yes, sir.
So I'm throwing out radical ideas, eliminate public companies. Obviously, I understand it's an insane idea.
It's yes, just a suggestion. People should understand that.
It's something to play with as a thought experiment.
Yes.
Number 2, tax reform. I kind of suggested that, so the radical tax reform idea was taxing wealth in the form of companies by issuing shares, right? But in general, I think equalizing the way that income tax rates of taxation, as well as basically adjusting I suggested eliminating write-offs on interest for mortgages, as well as setting it up so that normal people could benefit like a business. Say, so you're a teacher, you can get the same benefit as a company if you're writing off school supplies or something.
Then you have some education reform as well.
Education reform, yeah.
That's
financial education, I think, is important.
Yep.
Taxes, eliminating predatory lending, in particular stuff like payday loans, as well as like gamifying savings and some of these other things, making it that you can declare bankruptcy from student loans.
Yeah, making it so you can, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. Yep. Eliminating the corporate welfare, or at least minimizing it as much as possible.
And probably introducing a new tax bracket for, scratch that. What you were just suggesting with the society having a piece.
Yeah, something like that. And then obviously, we talked a little bit about, having the basics, like trying to drive the cost down for the basics, trying to make it so that people are able to have healthcare, able to have, equality in education. We'll do a whole video on education, but one of the examples, what they do in Sweden is the funding follows the student. Everybody basically gets the same funding per student. and then schools compete for students in order to get better quality of education or better costs, et cetera. They're for-profit institutions, but that way you don't end up with lower funding based on living in a poorer neighborhood. And so,
Makes sense.
kind of a similar thing. So those would be some suggestions that I have.
The last one is that the government should spend the money that they're allocating in, say, in the medical sector or whatever more efficiently, right?
Yeah. I mean,
more effectively.
I think that's like governments are incompetent, and government competence improving. I think we're going to do a whole series on governance reform because I think that's a super important thing, but doing something to address so that the costs are lower so that you can enable a lot about this other stuff. A lot of it is like you solve a lot of problems if you can do things efficiently. And so yeah, those would be
well, guys,
ideas.
if we missed any of them, please comment down below. Let us know. We would love to talk about them in more details. So
click the subscribe button and the notification button. And if you liked this, click the like button too. Share it with your friends. We want to get a lot of people who are participating in the conversation.
Yes.
And so, it's great if you can share this with some people and let them, get their ideas. If you know somebody that we should interview, maybe you can introduce us. We're happy to bring them on and we'll have a conversation with them.
Absolutely.
They might have some great ideas that we don't have. We're like just, spitballing weird ideas here, discussing ideas.
And if there's anything we can do to improve, please let us know. We take feedback to heart. We are looking at everything.
We take it very seriously. We cry a lot at negative
exactly.
feedback. So just positive feedback.
We have a room over there. No, it's no, but yeah, we take feedback very seriously. We do read all the comments, so please let us know your thoughts.
Awesome. We will see you guys on the next episode.
See you on the next episode.